Welcome, weary traveler of the modern age. You've arrived at the threshold of a time so distant, so utterly different, and so full of discomfort that it almost guarantees your eyelids will grow heavy just hearing about it. Tonight, we venture not into the bright corridors of royal castles or thrilling tournaments of chivalry, but instead into the cold, muddy, and deeply mundane existence that most people in the medieval world called daily life. This is your introduction to the long, sleepy journey we call the Dark Ages. Imagine waking not to the gentle beep of an alarm clock or the soft light filtering through curtains, but to the harsh clang of a dull iron bell tolling above a village cloaked in thick, choking fog. It's a raw, biting morning, the kind that seeps through the cracks of your wooden hut and gnaws at your skin. You stir on a thin, lumpy mattress of straw, but it's no mattress at all. Just a sack stuffed with coarse, moldy straw, crawling with lice and fleas. The floor beneath is hard earth, cold and damp, and a faint smell of smoke and rot lingers in the air. You're not alone. The hut's cramped walls hold your entire family, 6 souls crammed side by side, sharing space with restless goats and squawking chickens, whose noises blend with the rattling of a wooden bucket collecting the night's waste. The air is thick with smoke from the single hearth, its acrid scent clinging to your threadbare clothes and matted hair. There is no privacy, no warmth, just the constant gnawing of hunger and the ever-present itch of parasites burrowing into your skin. You've long since stopped counting the scratches and sores, focusing instead on the ache that never leaves your joints, a constant reminder of the relentless labor that awaits. Your teeth, stained and broken from coarse black bread and meager portions of gruel, ache sharply in your dry mouth, and you long for clean water, though even if it were available, it's often contaminated with invisible enemies, bacteria and parasites that your weak body can barely fight off. Outside, the village is a mire of mud and waste. The narrow paths are slick with a fetid mixture of animal manure, human excrement, and rotting refuse tossed from doorways. Children run barefoot through the streets, their feet thickened with dirt and calluses, but vulnerable to infection. The stench is overpowering yet familiar, a constant companion as you step cautiously through the filth. The thin wooden houses are huddled together against the cold, their roofs thatched with straw or wood shingles, many sagging under the weight of years and neglect. You can hear the low groans of your neighbors waking, frost stiffening their limbs as they stretch and prepare for the day ahead. Your day begins long before dawn, in the biting cold. There is no time to dawdle, no luxury to rest. Your family's survival depends on the labor you put in from the moment your eyes open. You might be tasked with feeding the livestock, fetching water from the village well or river, or helping in the fields. The fields themselves are unforgiving, poor soil worked hard and often failing to produce enough crops. The harvest last year was meager, and this year looks no better. Hunger is a constant shadow, gnawing at your belly and sapping your strength. Your diet is monotonous and sparse. Barley and oats form the base of every meal, boiled into tasteless porridge that barely fills your stomach. Meat is a rare luxury, usually salted or smoked, and often spoiled before it reaches your table. Vegetables are boiled until all flavor has drained away, and fruit is an occasional, fleeting indulgence reserved for the lucky or the wealthy. Milk may be available from the family cow or goat, but it spoils quickly in the summer heat and can harbor parasites that cause illness. The lord of the manor owns the land you toil on, and most of what you grow or raise must be surrendered as rent or taxes. You work his fields for several days a week without pay, your own crops just enough to keep you alive. Any bad harvest, drought, or early frost could mean starvation for your entire family. Famine is a grim reality, a slow and painful specter that haunts every villager, creeping in with the failure of crops or the loss of livestock. Disease is an invisible, merciless killer that stalks the village as relentlessly as any raiding band or wolf pack. There are no doctors, no nurses, no modern medicine. If illness strikes, you are left to suffer and pray. The few wise women in the village might know herbs and remedies, but their knowledge is limited and often mixed with superstition. Diseases like smallpox, plague, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Entire families can be wiped out in days, buried hastily in shallow graves outside the village boundaries. No one truly understands what causes these outbreaks, but many blame sin, demons, or foul air. Quarantine is rare and ineffective, and fear of contagion often turns neighbors against each other. Even the smallest wounds can become death sentences. A scrape from your wooden plow or a cut from a rusty nail might become infected. Without antiseptics, gangrene sets in quickly. The only treatment is brutal and primitive: amputation with a rusty knife or axe, performed without anesthesia, often with nothing but a swig of ale or a leather strap to bite down on. The pain is unimaginable, the risk of death high. Violence is woven into the fabric of daily life. The Dark Ages are not the romantic era of chivalry and noble knights you might imagine. Raids and attacks by Vikings, bandits, or rival lords are common, turning peaceful villages into battlegrounds. Hearing a war horn sends families scrambling to hide in the forest or flee into the wilderness, praying for survival. Justice is brutal and arbitrary. Accusations of theft or disobedience might result in cruel trials by ordeal. Carrying red-hot iron, plunging hands into boiling water, or drowning tests where floating means guilt. The local knights are often mercenaries or enforcers who answer only to their lords and take what they want without mercy. As a peasant, you have no rights. You are property, bound to the land and subject to harsh punishment for disobedience. Women suffer the harshest fate of all. Girls are married off in their early teens, often to men twice their age. Childbirth is one of the leading causes of death, with no midwives or medical care in many villages. Complications during delivery almost always end in tragedy. Women bear the burden of household work, childcare, and field labor with little respite. Children are expected to work as soon as they can walk, contributing to the family's survival by tending animals, gathering firewood, fetching water, and helping in the fields. Childhood as we know it does not exist. Survival is their only lesson. The church wields enormous power, controlling every aspect of your life. Mass is mandatory, though most peasants do not understand Latin and only hear incomprehensible prayers. The clergy teach that suffering is part of God's plan, that obedience and humility will bring rewards in the afterlife. Tithing takes 1/10 of what little you own, further draining your resources. Questioning the church can lead to excommunication or being branded a heretic, a terrifying fate in a deeply religious world. For many, the church is not a source of comfort, but a symbol of power, control, and fear. Education is a distant dream, an unreachable luxury. Literacy is rare, confined to monks and nobles who own handmade books written in Latin. You cannot read or write. Your knowledge of the world beyond your village is limited to hearsay and stories. Travel is dangerous and discouraged. Bandits roam the forests, wolves hunt at the edges of the village, and crossing into another lord's land without permission can mean imprisonment or death. Your entire life is spent within a few miles of where you were born. Weather is a constant adversary. Your hut is poorly insulated, made from timber and wattle with a thatched roof that leaks during rainstorms. Winters bring bone-chilling cold, frostbite, and snowdrifts that block paths and isolate villages. Summer is hot and humid, but flies and mosquitoes spread disease. Storms can collapse your roof, forcing you to repair it yourself or live exposed to the elements. A drought means failed crops and famine. Each season is a gamble. Every year is a desperate hope to survive another cycle. Death is never far away. The average lifespan hovers around 30 years, skewed by high infant mortality rates. If you survive childhood, you might live into your 40s, but your body will be ravaged by arthritis, dental decay, chronic pain, and a lifetime of backbreaking labor. Funerals are simple affairs. No flowers, no comforting words, just a shallow grave marked by a wooden cross or a mound of earth. Your name and story will be forgotten within a generation unless you were born into wealth or infamy. Each day is a repetition of endless toil. You rise before dawn, work until your body aches, eat the same bland gruel, and collapse into a restless sleep only to begin again the next day. Joy is rare, and laughter even rarer. You are not a lord or a knight, not a merchant or a scholar. You are a serf, tethered to the land, your life controlled by others, your fate at the mercy of the weather, war, and cruel obligations. Dreams are dangerous distractions, hope a fragile luxury. You scream in silence, no one hears. You pray, but nothing changes. In the medieval Dark Ages, The true miracle isn't surviving a single day, it's surviving a lifetime. Let me know how medieval peasants survived the bitter winters. Winter in medieval villages brought profound changes. The vibrant colors of summer and the golden hues of autumn gave way to a subdued, often harsh landscape dominated by frost, ice, and snow. Fields that had once been tilled and sown lay barren and hardened beneath thick layers of frozen earth. The rich soil, cracked and lifeless, waited silently beneath the cold, the promise of spring buried beneath ice and snow. The trees, stripped of leaves and vitality, stretched their skeletal branches skyward. Their limbs shivered in cold winds that swept relentlessly across open fields and through narrow village lanes. These winds carried a biting chill that seemed to reach into the bones of all living creatures. Even the animals, both wild and domesticated, retreated into shelter and stillness as the temperature dropped. Snowfall was a familiar visitor. Sometimes it arrived as a light dusting that softened the edges of the landscape, muffling sounds and lending a hushed stillness to the village. At other times, it came in fierce blizzards that swallowed the horizon in a swirling white tempest. Visibility vanished, paths disappeared, and the usual rhythms of daily life ground to a near halt. The crunch of footsteps on frozen ground and the low murmur of voices became faint whispers under thick blankets of snow. The homes of peasants, simple constructions made from timber, wattle, daub, and thatch, offered modest shelter but little protection from the harshness of winter. Walls built from woven branches covered with mud cracked under the freeze, allowing cold drafts to creep inside. The roofs, though thick with straw, were often porous to wind and snow. These houses were designed with practicality and available materials in mind, not comfort or warmth. At the center of every home stood the hearth, the crucial source of heat, light, and a gathering point for family life. Fires were painstakingly maintained, using precious wood that had been gathered and stored during the warmer months. Logs and branches, carefully stacked and dried, fueled flickering flames that cast dancing shadows on walls darkened with soot. The smoke spiraled upward through simple chimneys or holes in the roof, carrying with it the sharp tang of burning wood and filling the room with a smoky haze. This fire was a fragile comfort. Its warmth rarely extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the hearth. Peasants huddled close to the flames, gathering in tight clusters on benches, stools, or straw-stuffed rushes laid upon the floor. Woolen cloaks, thick and rough, were pulled tightly around shoulders and bodies, trapping body heat. Blankets made from woven wool or animal pelts provided additional layers of insulation. Clothing during the winter months was both functional and necessary for survival. Multiple layers were worn to create a barrier against the cold. Thick wool tunics extended down to knees, often reinforced with leather patches on elbows and knees for durability. Underneath, linen shirts provided a softer inner layer, but wool remained the primary defense. Trousers were heavy and coarse, designed to retain warmth despite the damp and chill. Headwear was essential, as much heat was lost through the scalp. Wool caps or hoods covered heads and ears, often lined with fur or soft cloth. Scarves and hand-knit mittens or gloves shielded fingers and necks from frostbite. Footwear consisted of sturdy leather boots, usually lined or stuffed with straw, moss, or cloth to insulate against the frozen ground. Though not perfect, this layering helped peasants endure temperatures that might otherwise have been unbearable. The way peasants slept during winter reflected a desperate need to conserve warmth. Beds were sparse, simple wooden frames with straw-stuffed mattresses that were coarse and uneven. Animal skins, if available, were laid atop or beneath mattresses to add insulation. Families slept together in close quarters, often several people sharing a single bed. The proximity allowed body heat to be pooled and shared, creating a small island of warmth amid the cold. Movement was minimized during the long nights. Peasants avoided unnecessary activity to preserve energy and warmth, curling into tight positions beneath thick blankets. Even during the day, physical labor was tempered by the harsh conditions, with rest taken whenever possible to conserve strength. Food during the winter was scarce and carefully rationed. During the warmer seasons, peasants harvested root vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and parsnips. These hardy vegetables were stored underground in root cellars or pits lined with straw to protect them from freezing temperatures. They became the staple of winter meals, boiled or stewed into filling broths. Grains, too, were stockpiled. Barley, oats, and rye were ground into coarse flour to make dense breads and thick porridges. Meat was rare, often limited to salted or smoked cuts preserved from the autumn slaughter. Fish, when accessible, was dried or salted and added some variation to the diet. Stews simmered slowly over low flames, often stretched with vegetables and herbs to feed entire families. Every morsel was valued. Waste was considered a luxury peasants could ill afford. Bones from animals were boiled to extract every bit of nourishing marrow, and stale bread was fed to farm animals. This careful stewardship of food ensured survival throughout the long months when fresh produce and hunting were impossible. Water was another critical resource, difficult to obtain in the frozen landscape. Wells often iced over, and streams were clogged with sheets of ice. Peasants collected snow or chipped away ice, then melted it slowly over the fire. Drinking cold, unthawed water could freeze the mouth and throat, so warming it before consumption was a small but necessary task that added to the daily burden. Despite the frozen fields, farm work did not cease completely. Animals required daily care. Horses, cows, and sheep needed feeding, watering, and shelter from the cold. Barns were kept as warm as possible, with fires burning near troughs to keep water from freezing. Milking, though less frequent, continued when possible to maintain the health of the herds. Tools and equipment required maintenance during winter. Blades were sharpened, wooden handles repaired, and leather goods conditioned near the fire. Repairs to homes and fences were done indoors or in sheltered workshops. Even children participated in lighter chores, learning the rhythms of survival and contributing to the family's efforts. Illness was a constant threat. The damp and cold weakened the immune system, making coughs, colds, and fevers frequent afflictions. Without modern medicine, treatments relied on herbal remedies, poultices, and prayers. Many succumbed to respiratory infections or complications from simple ailments, especially the very young and the elderly. Social life contracted significantly during winter. Travel was hazardous, and villagers tended to stay close to home to conserve energy and avoid accidents. Yet, communal faith provided solace. Church services, though fewer and often held in drafty, cold buildings, were vital sources of hope. Religious festivals like Christmas brought brief reprieves from the gloom, marked by special meals, gatherings, and small celebrations that lifted spirits. Lighting was precious and sparing during winter. Candles made from tallow burned dimly, their smoke mingling with that of the hearth. Lanterns, if available, were used cautiously to extend evening hours without wasting fuel. Darkness fell early and lingered long, shaping daily routines and limiting activities to daylight hours whenever possible. Throughout the frozen months, survival depended on resilience, community, and meticulous care. Peasants learned to read the signs of changing weather, stockpile and ration resources, and work together to endure the relentless cold. Their knowledge of the land and its seasons, passed down through generations, was essential to navigating winter's challenges. Despite these hardships, life continued, anchored by hope for the return of spring. The thawing of snow, the first shoots of green in the fields, and the longer days brought renewal. The cycle of seasons was harsh but predictable, and the peasants' endurance ensured the survival of village life and the promise of future harvests. The bitter winters of medieval times tested human limits, yet the perseverance and adaptation of peasants formed the backbone of rural society. Their ability to endure through cold, hunger, and isolation underpinned the stability of their communities and allowed culture, labor, and tradition to survive the harshest of seasons. Tested, copied, and pasted. Tools and techniques for winter survival. The survival of medieval peasants through the harsh winter months was heavily reliant not only on natural resources, but also on the practical tools and ingenious techniques developed over generations. These implements and methods were crafted with simplicity, functionality, and the pressing demands of winter conditions in mind. Their effectiveness was a testament to the wisdom born of necessity, as well as the intimate relationship peasants maintained with their environment. Winter preparation, the role of tools. Preparation for winter began well before the first frost settled on the fields. Throughout the year, Peasants maintained and fashioned tools necessary for the many chores that winter required. Axes, saws, and knives were sharpened to precision, as clean, efficient cuts were vital for gathering and processing firewood, arguably the most precious commodity during cold months. Without sufficient fuel, homes would grow unbearably cold, threatening both comfort and life. Axes were hand forged with iron heads and sturdy wooden handles, often made from ash or hickory, prized for their strength and resilience. The shape of the axe head varied by function, with some designed for chopping logs and others more suited for splitting wood along the grain. Maintaining the edge was a constant task, employing whetstones, rough, abrasive stones soaked in water or oil to sharpen blades. A dull axe not only increased labor but posed safety risks, making regular maintenance essential. Saws, when available, featured long, narrow blades with coarse teeth capable of slicing through frozen branches and logs. Woodworkers often constructed their own saws or repaired old ones, replacing worn teeth and oiling mechanisms to prevent rust. Sharpening saws was an art in itself, requiring special files and keen eyesight. Knives served numerous purposes, from skinning animals and preparing food to whittling small wooden items needed for repairs or crafts. Peasants favored versatile blades that could withstand repeated use in harsh conditions. Like axes, knives were kept sharp and clean, often housed in leather sheaths to protect edges and prevent injury. Firemaking and maintenance tools. Central to winter survival was the hearth, and maintaining a fire required specific tools. Iron pokers and tongs were indispensable for rearranging logs and coals, allowing for better combustion and safer handling. These tools were typically handmade by local blacksmiths and were valued possessions. Firewood was stored in sheds or covered piles near the home to keep it dry. Peasants often built wood racks elevated above the ground to prevent moisture absorption and decay. Tools such as wedges and mallets facilitated splitting large logs into smaller, more manageable pieces. The rhythmic sound of wood being split echoed through villages as families prepared their fuel supply. Kindling was gathered from twigs, dried grasses, and bark, materials that ignited easily and helped start fires quickly. Birch bark, with its high resin content, was especially prized for kindling, burning hot and bright even when damp. Knowledge of how to collect, dry, and store these materials was vital, as wet kindling could make fire starting a frustrating and lengthy process. In addition to physical tools, peasants mastered traditional techniques to kindle flames. The use of flint and steel was common, where striking one against the other produced sparks capable of igniting tinder. Tinder was often made from charred cloth or dry moss, collected from tree bark or forest floors. Some peasants crafted small nests of fine, dry fibers designed to catch even the smallest spark, allowing fires to be rekindled swiftly in the coldest moments. Clothing and textile techniques. Clothing was not only a matter of warmth, but also of craftsmanship. Peasants relied on wool as the primary material, known for its insulating properties and ability to retain warmth even when damp. Spinning wool into yarn was a fundamental skill. Spindles and spinning wheels, when available, transformed raw wool from sheep into workable threads. Knitting and weaving were essential techniques. While weaving produced cloth for broader applications such as cloaks and tunics, knitting provided gloves, stockings, and smaller garments. Knitted woolen gloves with tight stitching helped keep fingers nimble during outdoor work. Peasants often lined clothing with animal pelts or additional wool layers for added protection against piercing winds. Repair skills were critical. Clothing was patched repeatedly, as new garments were expensive and often handmade. Needles fashioned from bone or metal, along with strong threads spun from flax or wool, ensured garments could be mended. This constant upkeep prevented drafts and helped maintain the insulation necessary for survival. Food storage and preservation techniques. The ability to store and preserve food during winter was crucial. Root cellars were dug beneath homes or barns, cool and dark spaces where vegetables could be kept from freezing. These underground pits were lined with straw or hay to provide insulation and absorb excess moisture. The structure and depth of cellars ensured that temperatures remained stable, above freezing, but cool enough to prevent spoilage. Salting and smoking were widely used for meat and fish preservation. Salt was a valuable commodity, sometimes traded or stored in bulk by wealthier peasants. Meat was cured by rubbing salt into the flesh, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. After salting, meats were often hung in smokehouses or over low fires where slow smoke penetrated the meat, imparting flavor and further preserving it. Smoking techniques varied by region and resource availability. Wood types such as oak, alder, or fruitwood were chosen carefully to avoid overpowering flavors. Smokehouses were simple structures, often built from stone or wood, with openings to regulate airflow and allow smoke to circulate evenly around the hanging meat. Drying was another preservation method. Fish, herbs, and some fruits were hung on racks in well-ventilated areas, often near the hearth but out of direct contact with flames. The dry air and heat slowly removed moisture, extending shelf life. Peasants took care to protect drying foods from pests such as rodents and insects. Shelter and heating techniques. Building and maintaining adequate shelter was fundamental to winter survival. Walls and roofs were inspected and repaired before the first snow, with additional thatching applied to fill gaps and prevent leaks. Peasants sometimes reinforced walls with extra layers of mud and straw, creating a thicker barrier against cold winds. Inside, the hearth was carefully tended to maximize heat distribution. Stones were often placed near the fire to absorb warmth during the day, radiating it slowly throughout the night. In some cases, clay or brick ovens doubled as both cooking appliances and heat sources, retaining warmth for hours after the fire had died down. Peasants adapted their living arrangements to conserve heat. Smaller rooms or alcoves were created within larger spaces, often by hanging heavy fabrics or wooden partitions to contain warmth. Bedding was layered with straw and animal furs, and families slept together to share body heat. Portable braziers filled with hot coals were sometimes used to provide warmth in specific areas. These metal or clay containers were carefully handled to avoid fire hazards, but allowed some mobility of heat during the long nights. Water collection and management. Water, essential for life, became difficult to access during winter. Wells often froze, and natural sources were covered with ice. Peasants used ladles and buckets with long handles to break and retrieve water from frozen surfaces, or they melted snow carefully indoors. Techniques to store water for extended periods involved insulating containers and keeping them near the hearth to prevent freezing. Clay or wooden barrels lined with straw helped maintain liquid water. When possible, water was collected during warmer days and stored for use in colder times. Melting snow was labor-intensive and required constant vigilance to prevent contamination. Snow gathered from clean, elevated areas was preferred, as lower ground might be tainted by animal droppings or other debris. Communal woodpiles ensured that everyone had access to firewood, and collective work parties helped repair roofs and fences before winter. Shared ovens and smokehouses became centers of village life, pooling resources and labor for mutual benefit. Techniques for winter survival were passed down orally and through example, creating a rich tradition of practical wisdom. Elders taught younger generations the subtle art of weather prediction, the best places to find dry kindling, and how to interpret the signs of animals preparing for winter. This cooperation extended to emergency situations, such as helping neighbors whose homes were damaged or who had fallen ill. The harshness of winter fostered a strong sense of interdependence among villagers, where survival was not only an individual challenge, but a collective one. The role of food, diet, and nutrition in medieval peasant winter survival. Winter was the most critical season for medieval peasants, as it tested not only their physical endurance, but also their resourcefulness in maintaining a balanced diet under challenging circumstances. Surviving the cold months demanded more than mere caloric intake. It required strategic food storage, preservation, and consumption to sustain health, energy, and immunity. This segment explores the intricacies of medieval peasant diet, the types of foods available during winter, preservation methods, nutritional challenges, and the social implications of food in the coldest months. Food availability in winter, challenges and limitations. During the growing seasons of spring and summer, peasants depended heavily on agriculture, animal husbandry, and foraging to secure a diverse diet. However, winter brought scarcity. Fields lay fallow under frost and snow, and wild plants and fruits were mostly unavailable. The reliance on stored provisions made preparation before winter essential. Failure to stockpile enough food could mean starvation or severe malnutrition. Grains were the cornerstone of the peasant diet, primarily barley, rye, and oats. Wheat was less common among peasants due to its higher cost and better use by wealthier classes. Harvested in late summer and early autumn, these grains were threshed, winnowed, and stored in granaries or clay pots to protect them from moisture and rodents. Dried grains were remarkably resilient to winter conditions and could be ground into coarse meal or flour throughout the cold months. Vegetables were mostly root crops such as turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions, all of which could be stored in root cellars or buried in straw-filled pits beneath the soil to prevent freezing. Cabbage was also a staple, often fermented into sauerkraut, a vital source of vitamin C during winter. This preservation method not only extended shelf life, but helped prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Meat availability was limited and highly dependent on the success of autumn hunts and animal husbandry practices. Fresh meat was a luxury, usually reserved for feast days or special occasions. More commonly, peasants consumed salted, smoked, or dried meats preserved in smokehouses or cured with salt to prevent spoilage. Pork was often preferred, as pigs could forage in woodland and undergrowth and be slaughtered in late autumn before winter set in. Fat from animals was also rendered into lard, a crucial cooking fat and preservative agent. Dairy products, including milk, cheese, and butter, played a significant role in nutrition, but became scarce during winter as animals produced less milk due to limited grazing. Cheese, especially hard cheeses, was a valuable protein source that could be stored for months. Butter was used both as a food and to fuel lamps. Wild game and fish supplemented the diet when available. Peasants living near rivers or coasts relied on fishing, drying, or salting their catch for winter use. Trapping and hunting small game such as rabbits and birds helped supplement caloric intake, but required skill and tools. Food preservation techniques. Food preservation was critical to survive winter scarcity. Medieval peasants used multiple methods adapted to their environment, tools, and available resources. These techniques ensured that essential nutrients were available during months when fresh produce was impossible to cultivate. Drying was among the oldest and simplest methods. Herbs, grains, and fruits were dried in the sun or near the hearth to remove moisture, preventing bacterial growth. Peasants hung bundles of herbs like thyme and rosemary, which also served medicinal purposes during winter illnesses. Salting and curing were vital for meat and fish preservation. Salt, although expensive, was often procured via trade or collected from salt springs or salt pans. Meat was heavily salted or brined, drawing out moisture and creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. After salting, meats were frequently smoked over slow fires, using woods such as oak or alder. The smoking process added antimicrobial properties and a distinctive flavor. Fish, particularly herring and cod, were similarly salted and dried, creating durable staples for winter meals. Fermentation extended the life of vegetables and grains. Sauerkraut, made from shredded cabbage fermented with natural bacteria, was a key source of nutrients and was especially important in preventing vitamin deficiencies. Other fermented foods included preserved beans and pulses. Bread dough itself sometimes underwent longer fermentation, improving digestibility and shelf life. Pickling was practiced using vinegar or brine solutions to preserve cucumbers, onions, and other vegetables. These methods ensured variety and added flavor to otherwise monotonous winter diets. Dietary composition and nutritional impact. The peasant winter diet was heavily carbohydrate-based, providing the bulk of daily calories through bread, porridge, and root vegetables. These carbohydrates were vital for energy, especially in cold weather when maintaining body heat required more calories. Proteins came primarily from preserved meats, dairy, legumes, and occasional game or fish. Although meat was less common in winter, the protein in salted pork or smoked fish was vital for muscle maintenance and immune function. Fats, often from animal sources such as lard, butter, and tallow, were necessary to provide concentrated energy and aid in the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. Fat also helps sustain warmth by providing insulation through body fat reserves. Vitamins and minerals presented a significant challenge in winter. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables risked deficiencies, particularly vitamin C and D. Peasants mitigated this through the consumption of fermented vegetables and by drying herbs rich in micronutrients. Sunlight exposure was limited during winter, increasing the risk of rickets and other deficiency diseases, but many relied on winter festivals and religious fasts to structure their eating habits around available foods. Meal patterns and food preparation. Winter meal patterns often shifted compared to other seasons. Food scarcity meant that meals were simpler, smaller, and sometimes less frequent. The day might begin with a warm porridge made from barley or oats, cooked slowly over the hearth. This meal provided necessary warmth and calories before the day's labor. The main meal, usually eaten midday, was the most substantial. It might include pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Pottage was versatile, allowing for whatever ingredients were available, cooked together in large cauldrons over open fires. The thick, nourishing dish was often seasoned with herbs or onions to improve flavor. Evening meals were typically lighter, sometimes just bread and cheese or leftover pottage. Hot drinks made from herbal infusions or diluted ale provided warmth and hydration. Peasants often used communal ovens or hearths where families or neighbors baked bread in batches to conserve fuel and labor. Baking was labor intensive and required skill, especially in temperature control and dough preparation. Social and cultural dimensions of food in winter. Food in medieval peasant society was more than sustenance. It held social, cultural, and symbolic importance. Winter was a time for communal feasting during religious holidays such as Christmas, Twelfth Night, and Candlemas, when food scarcity was momentarily alleviated and celebrations reinforced social bonds. These feasts provided opportunities to share meat, special breads, and sweetened dishes made with honey, an expensive and prized commodity. Such occasions also offered respite from the hardships of winter and reinforced community cohesion. Food sharing extended to acts of charity. The church encouraged almsgiving, and wealthier peasants or village leaders might distribute surplus food to the poor. This support was critical during harsh winters when famine and disease threatened survival. The role of women in food preparation was central. They managed the storage of food, preservation processes, cooking, and feeding the family. Their knowledge of herbs, preservation, and nutrition was passed down through generations, forming a vital cultural repository. Coping with winter food shortages, famine, and adaptation. Despite preparation, some winters were harsh and long, leading to food shortages and famine. Crop failures, poor harvests, and disease could decimate supplies. In these times, peasants resorted to less desirable food sources, wild plants, tree bark, and even animals normally not consumed, such as certain rodents or birds. These desperate measures highlight the resilience and adaptability of peasant communities. They combine knowledge of local flora and fauna with communal sharing and bartering to survive. Religious fasting periods also influenced diets, requiring peasants to abstain from meat and sometimes dairy. During winter fasts, peasants increased consumption of legumes, grains, and vegetables, testing their creativity and resourcefulness in meal preparation. Conclusion: the centrality of food in winter survival. The medieval peasants' survival through winter was intricately linked to their ability to procure, preserve, and consume food that met their energy and nutritional needs under adverse conditions. Their diets were shaped by availability, seasonality, and cultural practices, reflecting a delicate balance between scarcity and sustenance. The ingenuity demonstrated in food preservation techniques, combined with social cooperation and cultural traditions, enabled peasants not only to endure, but also to maintain health and community stability during the most challenging season of the year. This interplay of environment, technology, and social structure reveals the complexity underlying what might superficially seem a simple struggle for survival. Why you wouldn't want to be a knight squire. In the grand tales of chivalry and medieval valor, knights stand as shining symbols of honor, bravery, and prestige. Their polished armor, swift horses, and gallant battles against foes and dragons sometimes capture our imagination. But before a knight could earn his spurs, he had to endure something far less glamorous: the grueling apprenticeship of being a squire. Far from the romanticized image of a young nobleman learning swordplay under a castle's golden banners, the daily life of a squire was exhausting, painful, and often thankless. This segment takes you deep into the reality behind the knightly title, a long, difficult journey filled with hard labor, endless chores, and harsh discipline. You'll quickly understand why, despite the allure of knighthood, most medieval youths would have reconsidered the offer to become a squire. That's the role of a squire, more than just sword training. Becoming a knight was not simply about waving a sword or charging into battle. The path began early, often around the age of 12, when boys, usually from noble families, were sent to serve as squires. Their primary role was to assist and learn from their knight patrons, but this assistance wasn't limited to training for combat. From dawn until well past dusk, squires were responsible for numerous duties. They cleaned and polished the knight's armor, a laborious task requiring attention to detail and physical stamina. Armor was heavy, cumbersome, and required regular maintenance to prevent rust and damage. Imagine scrubbing each joint, buckle, and plate using abrasive materials, often outdoors in the cold or rain, before the sun even rose. Squires were also tasked with managing the knight's horse and equipment. Horses, especially war horses, were expensive and delicate animals that required constant care. Feeding, grooming, mucking out stables, and ensuring the horse's tack was in good condition fell on the squire's shoulders. If a horse became injured or sick, it could mean disaster on the battlefield, so these duties were critical but demanding. Training, brutal and unforgiving. Though there was some sword and combat training, it wasn't the glamorous duel with opponents in shiny armor you might imagine. The instruction was often repetitive, physically grueling, and at times painful. Squires learned to wield heavy weapons, swords, lances, maces, many of which weighed far more than their own arms and required strength and endurance beyond their years. Training also involved long hours on foot, practicing footwork and positioning with instructors who could be harsh and unforgiving. Failure or mistakes weren't taken lightly. Injuries were common. Broken bones, bruises, and exhaustion came with the territory. In addition to martial skills, squires had to master horsemanship. Riding a horse while controlling a lance or sword required balance and coordination, practiced again and again until it became second nature. The grind of daily chores and servitude. Outside training, the rest of a squire's day was filled with servitude. They prepared the knight's meals, carried heavy armor and weapons during marches, and even ran errands, often in poor weather and over rough terrain. A squire's clothing was also a far cry from the fine attire of their noble family. The daily wear was practical and often coarse, made from heavy wool or linen that chafed the skin. When traveling or camping, squires slept on hard ground or straw bedding, sharing cramped tents with their knight and retinue. Comfort was minimal, privacy was non-existent. The social dynamics were also tricky. Squires were both apprentices and servants, expected to show deference to their knight while also managing their own fears and frustrations. The hierarchical structure of a medieval household was rigid. Disobedience or perceived slights could lead to punishment, sometimes physical, administered without hesitation. The physical toll, heavy loads and long marches. One often overlooked hardship was the physical strain. Knights rode into battle with dozens of pounds of armor, but squires often carried extra gear. On long campaigns, they would shoulder heavy packs filled with weapons, armor pieces, provisions, and camp supplies. Marching for miles across muddy fields, steep hills, or rocky roads while burdened with weight required stamina few children today could match. In winter or wet seasons, conditions worsened. Frozen ground or slippery mud made walking treacherous. The cold seeped through clothes, and squires sometimes suffered frostbite or illness from exposure. Illness could mean falling behind the group, punishment, or even death. Psychological pressures and expectations. Beyond the physical challenges, the mental pressure to succeed weighed heavily on squires. The ultimate goal was to become a knight, a status that could elevate one's social standing and wealth. Failure was not just personal, it reflected poorly on the family. Many squires faced intense competition. Only a fraction were ever knighted. Some died in battle before reaching that stage. Others were dismissed due to incompetence or injury. The constant awareness that any misstep could ruin their future added to the burden. At the same time, squires had to endure the tedium of long waits. Battles might be rare, and months of uneventful camp life involved standing guard, maintaining equipment, and watching drills. The contrast between the desire for glory and the reality of boredom was stark. The reality of knighthood, was it worth it? Even if a squire survived the apprenticeship and earned knighthood, the life that followed was not guaranteed to be glamorous. Knights were expected to fight in wars, often brutal and prolonged. The risk of death or crippling injury was high. Financial pressures were immense. Maintaining horses, armor, and status demanded resources many knights lacked, forcing some into debt or dependency on patrons. For many, knighthood was a lifelong struggle, with more days spent guarding castles, collecting taxes, or managing estates than charging into glorious battle. The unsung work behind the legend. When we remember knights, we often forget the countless hours of labor, failure, and endurance that preceded the title. The life of a squire was an essential, grueling foundation that shaped the warrior, but also one few would envy. Their story is a reminder that behind every legend are years of unseen effort, discomfort, and perseverance. The idealized image of chivalry masks a reality filled with sweat, dirt, bruises, and quiet sacrifices. The journey to knighthood began with the harsh realities of the squire's life, a daily grind of exhausting work, discipline, and duty. For every shining knight celebrated in history, many more squires endured countless hardships and never reached the accolade. Next time you read about a knight charging into battle, remember the boy who woke before dawn, polished armor until his hands were raw, tended to horses in freezing weather, and learned to wield a sword with trembling muscles. The knight's glory was built on the squire's sweat. Why you wouldn't want to live in a medieval castle? When we think of medieval castles, it's easy to imagine romantic stone fortresses perched on hilltops, banners fluttering in the breeze, and brave knights standing watch. Fairy tales, films, and fantasy novels paint them as luxurious places filled with adventure and royalty. But the reality of living in a medieval castle was far different from these dreamy portrayals. Life inside these stone giants was often cold, dark, smelly, noisy, and incredibly uncomfortable. In this segment, we journey inside the high walls and towering keeps to uncover what daily life was truly like in a medieval castle. You might soon realize that despite their majestic appearance, castles were more prisons of power than palaces of comfort. Cold stone and constant chill. One of the biggest surprises about castle life was just how cold it was. Made almost entirely of thick stone, castles acted like refrigerators. During the winter months, these stones held in the cold, and in the summer, they did little to offer relief from the heat. Fireplaces were rare and expensive to maintain. Only the Great Hall or the Lord's Chamber might have one, and even then, the heat it provided was limited to a small area. Servants and soldiers often slept in rooms with no heat at all, bundled in layers of rough wool blankets, hoping to survive the night. There was no central heating, no insulation, and certainly no double-pane windows. Drafts entered through arrow slits and broken shutters. Floors were often bare stone or rough planks covered in straw. It wasn't uncommon to wake with frost on your bedding. Filth and the stench of daily life. Castles were not the clean, sparkling fortresses portrayed in stories. In fact, they were often filthy. Waste disposal was primitive. Privies, early toilets, emptied into cesspits or moats, and the smell was ever present. Chamber pots were used at night and emptied out of windows in the morning, hopefully with a shout to warn anyone below. Bathing was infrequent. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells or rivers and heated over fires. For most people in the castle, a full bath was a rare luxury. The nobility might have access to wooden tubs and perfumed oils, but the average servant or soldier cleaned themselves only occasionally. Rats and lice were common companions. The lack of sanitation meant disease spread easily. People suffered from illnesses we now prevent with basic hygiene, and plagues could sweep through a castle like wildfire. Darkness and dampness. Without electricity, castles relied on torches, oil lamps, and candlelight. Even on bright days, many castle interiors were dim. Narrow windows let in little sunlight, and rooms deep within the walls might remain completely dark unless artificially lit. But lighting was expensive. Candles were made from tallow, animal fat, and had a foul smell. Oil lamps were messy and dangerous. In many cases, people simply worked and lived in the dark. Reading, sewing, or writing by candlelight strained the eyes. Dampness added to the misery. Water seeped in through cracks in the stone, and in rainy months, some areas of the castle became muddy swamps. Mold and mildew were everywhere, and everything smelled of moisture and rot. The noise of power. A castle might look serene from the outside, but inside it was rarely quiet. Soldiers trained in the courtyard, blacksmiths hammered armor and weapons, servants clattered through hallways with buckets, and animals bleated, barked, or neighed in the stables. Add to this the yelling of commanders, the shouting of orders, and the frequent alarms or calls to action, and you had a cacophony that never truly stopped. At night, guards patrolled with clinking armor, and if a castle was under threat, horns or bells could shatter any moment of silence. Privacy was scarce. Most people slept communally. Curtains or wooden partitions might provide separation in wealthier chambers, but most inhabitants shared space, noise, and even beds with others. Limited food and grueling work. Food in a castle was not always the feast we imagine. While lords might enjoy meat, cheese, and sweet pastries at banquets, the daily diet for most was much simpler. Thick bread, porridge, beans, and onions made up the bulk of meals. Meat was a luxury, especially for the lower classes. Food preservation was also a problem. Without refrigeration, much of the food was salted, dried, or pickled. Fresh produce was seasonal, and in winter the diet became monotonous and vitamin deficient. Scurvy and other diseases were not uncommon. Work was relentless. Servants began their tasks before sunrise and continued into the night. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, repairs, animal care, and running messages up and down stone staircases made for an exhausting life. Even noble children were expected to learn responsibility early, with training in manners, reading, and religious devotion taking up much of their day. Fortification or imprisonment. Though castles were designed for protection, that very design often made them feel like prisons. Walls were high, windows small, and doors heavy. Movement was restricted. During a siege, inhabitants could be trapped inside for weeks or months with dwindling supplies and growing tension. Sieges brought fear and starvation. Attacks from trebuchets, ladders, and tunnels made every day dangerous. Disease could break out from the crowding and poor sanitation, and morale could crumble quickly. For women and children, the fear was magnified. They relied on the strength of the soldiers and walls to protect them, but often had nowhere to flee if the defenses failed. Disease and medical woes. Medical care in a medieval castle was rudimentary at best. There were no trained doctors as we know them today. Instead, barbers, monks, or herbalists handled most medical issues. Bleeding, leeching, and prayers were common treatments. Surgery, when it occurred, was done without anesthesia and often caused more harm than good. Infections spread easily, especially in a closed environment like a castle. Open wounds, poor nutrition, and lack of cleanliness meant even small injuries could turn deadly. Childbirth was risky, and infant mortality rates were high. The stress of castle life also took a toll on mental health. Anxiety, paranoia, and trauma went undiagnosed. A lord might appear noble and just to outsiders, but rule his household with fear and violence. A life of hierarchy and rules. The social structure in a castle was rigid. Everyone knew their place, from the lord and lady down to the lowest kitchen boy. Respect had to be shown at all times. Servants bowed, soldiers saluted, and punishment for disobedience was swift. Women, even noble women, had limited freedom. Marriages were often arranged, and education was focused on preparing for domestic life. Few had access to books or writing, and many could not read. Entertainment was limited. There might be music, storytelling, or the occasional feast, but for most days, life was repetitive and focused on survival. Time passed slowly, especially in winter. Conclusion: a harsh reality behind the stone walls. The majestic appearance of medieval castles hides a tough, gritty reality. Life within their walls was hard, cold, and uncomfortable. They offered safety from invaders, but few luxuries to those living inside. From the foul smells to the punishing labor, from the ever-present danger of war to the strict hierarchy, castle life was a challenge for all but the highest nobility, and even they weren't exempt from hardship. So next time you see a picturesque castle perched above a sleepy valley, remember that behind its stone walls were flickering torches, aching backs, damp straw beds, and the daily grind of survival. As impressive as they are from the outside, you might find yourself grateful for modern plumbing, heating, and a quiet night's sleep. The role of the kitchen in castle food culture. While much of medieval castle life was harsh and uncomfortable, one area that played a crucial role in maintaining the castle's daily rhythm was the kitchen. Though far from the gourmet institutions we might imagine today, castle kitchens were essential to feeding the many people who lived, worked, and passed through these formidable stone fortresses. Food preparation, preservation, and service were labor intensive, and the kitchen staff operated under constant pressure to keep up with demands, whether for a simple servant's porridge or a lavish lordly feast. A single medieval castle could house dozens to hundreds of people, especially during times of war or events like tournaments or feasts. The lord, lady, their family, knights, squires, servants, soldiers, and occasional guests all needed food. Feeding such a large and diverse group was no small task. Most meals for the lower ranks were simple and filling. Stews, breads, and coarse ale formed the staple diet for many. Workers and soldiers received nourishing but repetitive meals that prioritized calories over flavor. These meals were often eaten in the great hall or nearby courtyards, with large cauldrons simmering over open flames and bread baked in enormous communal ovens. The higher one's status, the more elaborate the meals. Lords and their families enjoyed meat, cheese, fruit, and even imported spices. Their meals could span multiple courses, served with wine or mead. However, such feasts required tremendous preparation and only occurred on special occasions. Castle kitchens were located in separate buildings or wings to minimize the risk of fire. They were large, smoky, noisy, and extremely hot, especially in summer. Great hearths and ovens burned nearly all day, with large spits turning game and cauldrons bubbling with stew or soup. Dozens of servants, including cooks, scullions, and spitboys, worked from dawn to dusk. The master cook directed the action, ensuring that dishes were prepared correctly and presented on time. Each kitchen had its own rhythm and order, honed over years of practice. Tasks were highly specialized. One group might be responsible for roasting meat, while another handled baking. Scullions, often the lowest ranking servants, were tasked with cleaning pots and pans, scrubbing floors, and fetching water. Backbreaking and thankless work. Getting fresh ingredients was not always easy. Castles relied on their surrounding lands for grains, vegetables, and meat. Game could be hunted in nearby forests, while fish were often caught from local rivers or stocked ponds. Preserving food was a constant concern, especially in winter. Without refrigeration, the castle used several methods to prolong shelf life. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were standard techniques. Barrels of salted pork or fish, wheels of hard cheese, and jars of preserved fruits filled the castle pantries. Root vegetables, such as onions, garlic, carrots, and turnips, were stored in cool, dry cellars. Flour, barley, and oats were kept in sacks or bins. Spices, a sign of wealth and power, were carefully stored in small amounts and guarded closely. Eating in a medieval castle wasn't just about nourishment. It was also a statement of status and ritual. Meals in the Great Hall were grand affairs. Tables were set according to rank, with the lord and lady at the high table and others seated according to their social standing. Servants brought water for hand washing before the meal, as cleanliness, at least for the noble class, was a mark of respect. Food was served on trenchers, which were thick slices of stale bread or wooden plates. Diners often ate with their fingers or used knives, as forks were rare. Entertainment might accompany dinner, music, jesters, or poetry readings. The mood was festive, but rules of conduct were strictly followed. Speaking out of turn or reaching across the table was considered rude. Leftovers from these feasts were not wasted. They were distributed to lower-ranking servants or even the poor at the gates, a practice known as alms for the hungry. Aside from the kitchen, other vital rooms included the pantry and buttery. The pantry was where bread and dry goods were stored and prepared. The head of the pantry, the pantler, kept strict records of inventory, ensuring that nothing went missing. The buttery, not to be confused with anything related to dairy, was in charge of storing and serving beverages, primarily ale and wine. The butler managed these stores, a trusted and prestigious position. During feasts or celebrations, the pantry and buttery coordinated closely with the kitchen to ensure a seamless dining experience. Religion played a significant role in the medieval diet. The church enforced fasting days, often twice a week and during Lent, when eating meat was forbidden. On these days, the castle kitchen shifted to fish and vegetable dishes. In larger castles, fish ponds or access to rivers made these transitions manageable. Feasts to honor saints or holy days were also part of castle life. On these days, no expense was spared. The kitchen turned out elaborate dishes, including pies filled with game or birds, custards, sugar sculptures, and more. These meals were as much about showing piety and wealth as enjoying good food. Working in a castle kitchen came with hazards. Burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation were common. Fires could easily spread, and injuries were difficult to treat. During sieges, the kitchen faced incredible pressure to ration food and stretch supplies. Spoiled food also posed a risk. Without modern understanding of bacteria, people often unknowingly ate contaminated items. Food poisoning could spread rapidly, weakening a castle's defenses from within. Food theft was another problem. With so many hands involved in preparation, pilfering spices, wine, or dried meat was tempting. Harsh penalties awaited those caught stealing, including whipping or dismissal. In a medieval castle, control over food meant control over people. A lord's ability to feed his household was a symbol of power. Hosting feasts demonstrated wealth, hospitality, and influence. Denying food was a form of punishment or coercion. Rations were adjusted based on loyalty and behavior. Servants who performed well might receive meat, wine, or other rare treats. Soldiers relied on steady meals to maintain strength and morale. During times of siege, distributing dwindling supplies became a political decision as much as a practical one. Food shortages, famine, or poor harvests could destabilize an entire household. In these times, the kitchen became a focal point of tension and resilience. Though often overlooked in stories and depictions, the kitchen was the beating heart of a medieval castle. It was where nourishment was crafted, daily routines were upheld, and celebrations came to life. The toil of kitchen workers ensured that the massive machinery of castle life kept moving through peace, feast, and war alike. While castle life as a whole was filled with hardship, the kitchen brought warmth, aroma, and rhythm to otherwise bleak halls. From humble porridge to extravagant feasts, the food culture of the medieval castle reflected its values, structure, and survival. In the end, the castle kitchen reminds us that even in the coldest stone fortresses, human hands work tirelessly to create moments of comfort, connection, and sustenance. Weapons training and the squire's brutal education. Before a squire could ever dream of becoming a knight, he had to endure a rigorous and often grueling period of training that shaped his body, mind, and spirit. Life as a squire in a medieval castle was far from romantic. It was a relentless trial by fire. From dawn until dusk, the young apprentice was immersed in a brutal regime of weapons training, horsemanship, and physical endurance, all while navigating the strict hierarchy and etiquette of the noble household. Each day for a squire began before the sun rose. Woken by the clanging of bells or a stern call from the knight or senior page, a squire was expected to present himself clean, alert, and ready for the day's training. The morning routine often began with stretches and exercises meant to build strength and flexibility. These exercises included lifting weights, often heavy stones, wrestling matches with fellow squires, and running laps around the castle grounds in full or partial armor. Physical readiness was paramount. A knight's armor was heavy, and in battle, endurance was as critical as skill. To prepare, squires ran while carrying shields or logs, climbed towers in mail shirts, and learned to fall and recover quickly in a melee. Central to a squire's education was mastery of weapons. The first tools of his training were not deadly swords or lances, but wooden replicas. With these, he learned form, timing, and precision. Under the eyes of grizzled veterans or the knight himself, the squire practiced tirelessly. Swordsmanship training focused on stances, parries, and strikes. It was repetitive and painful, especially when mistakes were corrected with a sharp rap across the knuckles or a trip to the muddy training pit. Spears and lances followed, with emphasis on thrusting from horseback. Shield work, both defensive and offensive, was taught in tandem. Squires drilled blocking arrows, bracing against charges, and creating wall formations with their peers. Archery was a daily exercise. Although not every knight fought with a bow, understanding its use was critical. Squires trained on longbows, crossbows, and throwing weapons like javelins. Accuracy was rewarded, sloppiness led to more laps. A knight without a horse was no knight at all. Riding was central to a squire's training. It began with grooming and saddling the horses of higher-ranking knights. This taught patience and respect for the animal. Mounting and dismounting with grace and speed came next. Once a squire could ride steadily, the real work began. They practiced riding at full gallop, turning sharply, and controlling the horse in chaotic environments. With time, they trained in mounted combat, holding a shield in one hand and striking with the other, aiming a lance while charging, or navigating a jousting course. Injuries were common. Being thrown from a horse could break bones or worse. But the expectation was to get back up, wipe the blood from your nose, and try again. Sparring sessions were a daily occurrence. Wooden weapons were gradually replaced with blunt metal versions. Fights took place in the training yard under the supervision of the weapons master. These battles were brutal, often resembling real combat. A squire might find himself facing multiple opponents or being put into matches with unfair disadvantages. The goal was to prepare for the unpredictability of real war. Bruises, sprains, and cracked ribs were all part of the experience. Full melee exercises involved teams of squires fighting in mock battles. These sessions were chaotic, noisy, and exhausting. Strategy, teamwork, and awareness were emphasized, alongside raw aggression. Being a knight wasn't only about brute strength. A squire's training also included lessons in chivalry, heraldry, and religious instruction. The code of chivalry guided a knight's conduct. Honor, loyalty, protection of the weak, and service to one's lord and lady. These ideals were drilled into the squire through sermons, readings, and practical application. They learned courtly behavior, how to bow, address nobility, and serve at banquets. Mistakes in etiquette were punished with chores or withheld meals. A squire had to show humility even as he trained to be a warrior. Heraldry lessons taught the meaning behind coats of arms and symbols, a necessity when identifying friend from foe on a chaotic battlefield. Squires also memorized prayers and religious texts, as piety was expected of any future knight. Each squire was assigned to serve a knight directly. This meant tending to the knight's armor and weapons, preparing his horse, and even helping him dress for battle. In doing so, the squire gained first-hand insight into the life he aspired to. He polished chainmail, oiled swords, mended torn gear, and accompanied the knight on hunts or patrols. If the knight traveled, the squire went along, carrying supplies or acting as a message runner. It was tiring, humbling work, but it built discipline and a deeper understanding of knighthood. Although rare, squires did have moments of respite. These times were often spent playing games that doubled as training, such as mock duels or horse races. They might also engage in storytelling or music, trying to maintain morale after a long day of bruising work. Fellow squires formed tight bonds. They trained, fought, ate, and bled together. Rivalries existed, but camaraderie often prevailed. These early brotherhoods would one day carry over into battlefield loyalty. The life of a squire was not shielded from cruelty. Hazing by senior squires or even knights was common. Practical jokes could be dangerous, and beatings were sometimes doled out for perceived insolence or poor performance. Moreover, failure in training had consequences. A squire who couldn't keep up risked being demoted to a stable boy or kitchen servant. Few things were more humiliating than being cast down in the eyes of the court. Beyond castle walls, squires trained in open fields. They participated in mock sieges, learned how to lay traps, and drilled in group tactics. Hunting excursions were both sport and practice, as they taught tracking, endurance, and using weapons in dynamic environments. Squires often hunted wild boar or deer alongside knights. This built courage and sharpened instincts. A squire's performance in the hunt was closely watched by their knight and lord. By their mid to late teens, squires who had shown courage, skill, and honor might be deemed ready for knighthood. Before this transition, they faced a ceremonial trial. The night before, they would fast, pray, and reflect on their journey. Their weapons were laid on an altar, and they often kept vigil over them. At dawn, they would be dubbed a knight, sometimes after proving themselves in battle or saving their lord in a campaign. But many never made it. Illness, injury, or disgrace could end a squire's dreams. The training of a squire was as much about forging character as honing combat skills. It demanded total commitment, physical toughness, and inner resolve. For those who survived its brutal rigors, the reward was entry into a warrior elite, the knighthood. But for every squire who was knighted, many more fell short. In the end, the squire's life was a crucible. It was in the endless drills, painful lessons, and moments of doubt that the knight's spirit was born. A squire was not merely trained to fight, he was trained to endure, to serve, and above all, to uphold a legacy of discipline and honor that would echo through medieval history. Tournaments and public tests of valor. For a squire nearing the end of his training, nothing was more anticipated and more feared than the grand tournaments. These events were far more than lively spectacles. They were proving grounds where reputation, skill, and courage were tested in the eyes of nobles, knights, and even royalty. Tournaments were a blend of chaos and chivalry, danger and display, and for a young squire, they presented the first opportunity to display his readiness for knighthood. Medieval tournaments were often held in vast fields just outside the castle walls. The grounds were prepared with wooden barriers for jousts, combat rings for melees, and stands for spectators. Banners of noble houses fluttered in the wind, and vendors sold everything from roasted meats to fine fabrics. For the common folk, it was a festival. For the knights and squires, it was deadly serious. Before the games began, a squire's role was largely logistical. He would help his knight prepare armor, sharpen weapons, and inspect the horse tack. This was a test of attention to detail. A missing buckle or cracked lance tip could be disastrous in the arena. The atmosphere was electric. Trumpets signaled the start of events, and nobles arrived in elegant attire. Ladies of the court often watched from elevated pavilions, evaluating the valor and grace of each competitor. For a squire with aspirations, impressing both lords and ladies could advance his station considerably. Tournaments included various events, the most prominent being the joust, the melee, and the individual duels. Each tested different aspects of a warrior's capability. The joust, perhaps the most iconic event, jousting required two mounted knights or squires to charge at each other with lances, aiming to strike their opponent's shield or unhorse them. The impact was bone-shaking, and injuries were common. For squires, an unhorsing was not simply embarrassing, it could be career-ending. The melee, a chaotic group battle with dozens of participants, often fought in teams. The melee mirrored the confusion of real war. Weapons were blunted, but blows were real. Victory required not just strength, but strategy and endurance. Squires fought under their knight's banner, and were expected to follow commands amid the tumult. Duel of skill. Some tournaments featured duels with specific weapons such as swords, maces, or axes. These matches were judged not only by who won, but also by technique and style. A squire who fought with finesse and control could gain admiration even in defeat. While younger squires merely assisted, senior squires often participated in their own divisions. These lesser bouts were designed to give them experience and to identify those ready for the full test of knighthood. Participation was not automatic. A squire had to earn the right. His knight would vouch for his readiness, and the lord of the tournament would approve. This endorsement was no small matter. A squire fighting poorly could reflect badly on his patron. Before competing, a squire spent days preparing. He cleaned and tested his gear meticulously, trained with his comrades, and often consulted older knights for advice. Nerves were inevitable. The weight of armor, the roar of the crowd, and the presence of powerful onlookers added immense pressure. Though governed by rules, tournaments were dangerous. Concussions, broken bones, and even deaths occurred. Medical care was primitive. A squire struck by a poorly aimed lance could suffer permanent injury. Yet despite the risk, squires longed to compete. Triumph in a tournament could fast-track one's career. A particularly bold or skilled performance might attract the attention of a lord seeking a new knight, or even a king willing to bestow land. Defeat, however, had consequences. Some squires who were defeated publicly were reassigned to lesser duties or dismissed from noble service altogether. To fail was to be humiliated in front of peers, mentors, and potential patrons. Beyond the combat, Tournaments were rich in ritual and celebration. Before the games, there were parades where knights and squires rode through town in full regalia. Squires carried their knight's standard, walking tall amid applause or jeers. There were ceremonial blessings by clergy, music from minstrels, and poetry read aloud praising the values of knighthood. Many squires saw this as a preview of the respect they would gain if knighted. Some events included trials of skill beyond combat, mounted games like Quentin, striking a rotating target while riding, or mock rescues of maidens guarded by other squires. These helped develop agility, aim, and coordination. Courtly love played a curious role. Many squires fought under the favor of a lady, a scarf or token tied to the lance or helmet. This was not always romantic. It could be a sign of noble patronage or public alliance. A lady's favor could elevate a squire's social standing. Victories won under such favor were celebrated in songs and stories. A squire who won with a lady's colors might be granted a private audience or reward. Lords observed closely. They watched not only for skill, but for poise, bravery, and respect for the chivalric code. A squire who showed cruelty, cowardice, or arrogance could lose their support, regardless of his prowess. For many squires, tournaments marked the final test. Exceptional performance in one or more events often led to discussions of knighthood. A squire who held his ground against a seasoned knight or led a team to victory in the melee might be deemed ready. The dubbing could take place at the end of the tournament, often during a feast. The squire would kneel before a noble or knight, swear his oaths, and receive a ceremonial blow with a sword, the accolade. He would rise as a knight, cheered by the crowd. Other squires, while not knighted immediately, earned crucial recognition. They might be invited to serve at a higher court or receive sponsorship for further training. After the games, celebrations were held. Feasts lasted deep into the night, with roasted game, flowing wine, and storytelling. Squires who fought well were toasted and invited to dine beside knights and ladies. Prizes were given, fine cloaks, gold coins, or ornate swords. But often the greatest reward was respect. For a squire, being addressed by name by a noble or asked to retell his exploits was a sign he was no longer invisible. For those who failed, the aftermath was solemn. They returned to their duties bruised and chastened. Yet even in defeat, a squire could learn and grow. Many knights told stories of losses that became turning points. Though modern eyes might see tournaments as mere games, for medieval squires they were deadly serious. They forged warriors, settled rivalries, and displayed the ideals of knighthood to the world. For the young men dreaming of honor and duty, tournaments were the fires in which their identities were forged. Win or lose, the experience reshaped them. In every tournament field, stained with sweat and blood, legends were born, some loud, some quiet, all remembered by those who trained, fought, and endured. For the medieval squire, there was no clearer path to the glories and burdens of knighthood than these public tests of valor. How medieval people cleaned their teeth, hint, they barely did. In the shadowy corridors of medieval castles and the humble wooden cottages of peasants, oral hygiene was a topic scarcely discussed, and even more rarely practiced with any degree of regularity. The modern rituals of toothpaste, floss, and mouthwash were as foreign to a medieval villager as a smartphone or an electric toothbrush. Yet, contrary to the popular belief that medieval people simply allowed their teeth to rot in their heads unchecked, there were rudimentary methods for dental care, though by today's standards, they were inconsistent, unscientific, and often more cosmetic than curative. For the vast majority of the population, cleaning one's teeth was a makeshift affair, done without a second thought or any systematic approach. The concept of a toothbrush as we know it did not exist in Europe until much later. Instead, people sometimes used a chewed twig or a piece of linen cloth wrapped around a finger to rub their teeth clean. These methods, while crude, could remove some debris and plaque if done with frequency, but they were by no means universal practices. The upper classes, nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants, had slightly more awareness of their appearance and were more likely to engage in some form of dental maintenance. Manuscripts from the period occasionally include herbal recipes for mouthwashes and tooth powders. These mixtures might include ingredients like sage, salt, mint, or even crushed peppercorns, intended to freshen breath more than to preserve dental health. Salt was especially common, rubbed directly onto the teeth or dissolved in water for rinsing in hopes of reducing bad odors. Interestingly, some medieval dental advice came from ancient sources. Medieval physicians, when they addressed dental care at all, drew upon Greek and Roman writings. Galen and Hippocrates, though centuries dead, influenced thinking through Latin translations. These authorities recommended substances like vinegar or alum for oral hygiene, and medieval physicians followed suit, often applying such treatments in hopes of curing toothaches or preventing foul breath. Toothache was a dreaded and all too common affliction in medieval Europe. Without antibiotics, anesthesia, or reliable surgical techniques, any infection in the mouth posed a serious risk. A seemingly simple dental abscess could become life-threatening if the infection spread. People feared losing teeth not only because of the pain involved, but because there was little to be done once a tooth went bad. Dentistry as a profession did not yet exist in the modern sense, and dental care fell under the loose purview of barbers, monks, or the occasional itinerant tooth drawer. Tooth drawers were a grim and memorable part of the medieval medical landscape. Found at fairs, marketplaces, or traveling from town to town, these practitioners claimed the ability to cure tooth pain by pulling the offending tooth. Often, their technique was brutal. They would use rudimentary pliers or iron tools, sometimes heating them in fire to sterilize, though this was more coincidental than based on germ theory. Pain relief was minimal, limited to alcohol, prayers, or herbal poultices, and the extraction was performed with little precision. Bleeding was profuse, infections were common, and many people avoided tooth drawers unless desperation forced them to seek help. To cope with ongoing dental pain, people turned to folk remedies and charms. A commonly held belief was that worms caused toothaches, a theory likely stemming from the visible decay and cavities that resembled burrowing. Remedies to expel the tooth worm included smoking the mouth with burnt herbs or applying garlic or henbane to the gums. Some treatments involve chants or recitations of protective verses, invoking saints such as Apollonia, the patroness of dentistry. Her iconography, often depicting her holding a pair of pincers, was a familiar comfort to those suffering from unrelenting dental pain. The role of monasteries in healthcare extended to dental care, albeit informally. Monks often served as healers for their communities, using knowledge preserved in medical texts copied from ancient sources. Monastic gardens provided herbs for poultices and infusions. For dental care, monks might offer clove oil for numbing pain or concoctions of myrrh and vinegar to reduce inflammation. Their remedies were, again, more focused on alleviating symptoms rather than prevention. Despite the crude tools and mystical remedies, medieval people were not entirely oblivious to the concept of cleanliness. In fact, many cared about appearances, especially in courtly or religious settings. A fresh breath and clean teeth were considered signs of refinement, particularly among the elite. Some accounts describe noblewomen using scented waters to rinse their mouths, or nobles powdering their teeth with ground coral or chalk. However, these substances were abrasive and could damage enamel over time, doing more harm than good. Dental decay was common, but not as rampant among medieval peasants as one might assume. In fact, archaeological examinations of medieval skeletons show that while tooth loss and wear were frequent, widespread cavities were somewhat less common than in later centuries. The reason lies in diet. While sugary foods are the chief culprit of tooth decay today, sugar was rare and expensive in the medieval period, reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy. Peasants ate a coarse diet of bread, grains, vegetables, and dairy, foods that were often abrasive but not necessarily cavity-inducing. That said, coarse diets had their drawbacks. The grinding of grains using stone mills meant that flour often contained small particles of grit, which gradually wore down the teeth. By middle age, many people had significant dental wear, exposing nerves and leading to chronic pain. Additionally, because of poor nutrition and lack of dental care, periodontal disease was widespread. Gums became inflamed, teeth loosened, and eventually fell out. Children were not exempt from dental woes. From an early age, they consumed the same rough food and had the same limited access to any kind of dental hygiene. There was no concept of pediatric care in dentistry, and no effort to monitor or preserve baby teeth. If a child developed a severe toothache, the response was the same as for an adult: home remedies, prayer, or eventual extraction. Baby teeth lost prematurely could lead to malformed adult teeth, but this was simply accepted as part of life. By the end of the medieval period, some changes in dental care were beginning to emerge. Trade with the Islamic world introduced new medical texts and hygiene practices. Arabic scholars had preserved and advanced many Greek medical theories and wrote extensively on health, including oral care. Some European medical practitioners began incorporating these insights, though it would be centuries before dentistry was recognized as a formal field. Toothbrushes in a primitive form began to appear in Europe toward the late Middle Ages, inspired by Chinese innovations. These early brushes used hog bristles and were expensive imports, accessible only to the wealthy. Even so, the adoption of regular brushing would not become common until much later. Similarly, early toothpaste recipes began to appear, though they were more focused on whitening than preventing decay. In conclusion, the medieval person's approach to oral hygiene was shaped by limited knowledge, scarce resources, and a very different understanding of health. While they were not entirely indifferent to their teeth, their methods were rudimentary and often ineffective. A minor dental issue could easily escalate into a serious, even fatal condition. From herbal mouthwashes to exorcisms for the toothworm, medieval dental care was a blend of hope, folklore, and desperation. In such a world, a simple cut could kill you, but so could a bad tooth, hidden away behind a forced, painful smile. Medieval markets, loud, filthy, and full of thieves. To step into a medieval market was to plunge into a maelstrom of sights, sounds, and smells so vivid it could overwhelm the uninitiated. These bustling marketplaces, whether within city walls or held on open fields just beyond them, were the beating hearts of medieval economic life. But they were also chaotic, unsanitary, and fraught with danger. The medieval market was not simply a place of commerce, it was a microcosm of daily life, rife with social drama, street performers, pickpockets, and the occasional brawl. The market scene began at first light. Merchants arrived with carts loaded with goods: fresh produce, live chickens, bolts of wool, slabs of salted meat, barrels of ale, pots, pans, leather shoes, spices, tools, and more. Each item bore the mark of its origin and the labor that brought it there. Farmers from surrounding villages trekked in with their wares: eggs, onions, cabbages, and cheeses, ready to trade or sell. Artisans set up stalls boasting wares of their own creation: hand-forged knives, dyed fabrics, or hand-carved spoons. Bakers arranged hard loaves of rye bread and honey cakes. Brewers poured foaming cups of small beer, weak enough to quench thirst without rendering the drinker useless. As the day unfolded, the market swelled with activity. Women haggled over the price of radishes. Children darted between legs, hoping to snatch a free plum or marvel at strange goods from far-off lands. Peddlers shouted over each other, voices rising in a cacophony meant to drown out competitors. The air grew thick with the mingled smells of spices, manure, sweat, and roasted meats. There was no zoning or sanitation. Pigs wandered freely, dogs scavenged, and waste ran in open ditches. Flies clouded above meat stalls. Yet, for all its filth, the market was indispensable. Not all transactions were honest. The phrase, "let the buyer beware," rang truer in the medieval market than anywhere. Dishonest vendors watered down wine, added chalk to flour, or sold spoiled fish under a layer of herbs. Weights and measures were often rigged. The village reeve or market official might attempt to enforce fairness, checking scales and imposing fines, but bribery and leniency were common. Sharp-eyed customers had to watch every coin. Markets were also magnets for thieves. With crowds pressing together, it was easy for a deft hand to slip into a purse. Pickpockets, known as cut purses, honed their craft with precision. They worked in pairs or teams, one distracting the mark while the other made the cut. Victims would not notice until they went to pay and found their purse mysteriously absent. In wealthier towns, punishment was severe. A thief caught in the act might have a hand amputated, be whipped through the streets, or be placed in the stocks for public ridicule. But crime persisted. Poverty was rampant, and the bustling anonymity of the market provided ample cover. Adding to the disorder were entertainers and charlatans. Jugglers, fire breathers, and puppet shows dazzled the crowds. Wandering minstrels strummed lutes and sang tales of love and heroism, competing for attention and coin. Fortune tellers read palms or cast lots. Quack doctors peddled miracle tonics, claiming to cure gout, plague, or impotence. One might find a tooth drawer boasting of pain-free extractions beside a monk selling relics of dubious provenance. These figures added color and risk to the experience. Despite the chaos, the market was vital for survival. For peasants, it was often their only access to manufactured goods or tools they could not make themselves. For city dwellers, it was the primary source of food and trade. For rural villagers, markets were social events as much as economic exchanges. News traveled through gossip and shouted conversation. Marriages were arranged, disputes aired, and alliances forged. In larger towns, markets were more regulated. Charters granted by the king or local lord designated official market days and protected the rights of vendors. Certain cities held weekly or bi-weekly markets, while others hosted grand fairs that drew merchants from afar. These fairs, often lasting several days, were spectacles in their own right, combining trade with entertainment and religious observance. Monks might process with relics, nobles might judge contests, and entire households came for the excitement. Civic authorities tried to maintain order, posting guards or constables, especially during these fairs. Guilds also played a role in controlling quality and conduct. A guild of bakers, for instance, would regulate the size and weight of bread loaves and fine any member who cheated. A cobbler's guild might inspect shoes for quality. Yet, these institutions also protected their own and resisted outside competition, sometimes violently. For women, the market offered both opportunity and peril. Many women were vendors themselves, especially in food stalls, textiles, or dairy. Widows might earn a living selling ale or tending a market garden. But they were also vulnerable to harassment or assault in the crowded, unsupervised environment. Legal protections existed in theory, but justice often hinged on one's status, wealth, and connections. Currency was another source of confusion and contention. With dozens of coin types in circulation, some local, others foreign, fraud was rampant. Forgers clipped coins, melted them down, or stamped counterfeits. Market inspectors had to check coins for weight and legitimacy, and buyers often brought scales with them to verify value. The illiterate and uneducated were particularly vulnerable, as knowledge of coinage was a practical necessity. Religious festivals and saints' feast days amplified market culture. On such days, even more vendors flooded in and sales surged. Markets formed around churches, taking advantage of the influx of pilgrims. Religious items, prayer tokens, and holy water were sold alongside roast geese and sweetmeats. It was not uncommon for religious and secular life to blur in these settings, much to the consternation of some clergy who frowned upon such mingling. Amid this chaos, the medieval market served an essential function. It redistributed goods across regions, supported local economies, and linked distant communities. Merchants who braved roads teeming with bandits and poor infrastructure formed the backbone of trade networks. They brought back silk from the east, spices from Africa, and fine wines from southern France. Their presence lent cosmopolitan flair to even modest towns. By the end of the day, the market began to wind down. Vendors packed their goods or drank the remainder of their ale. Cleanup was minimal. Refuse remained where it fell, attracting rats and dogs. As twilight fell, the noise receded and the stalls emptied. Children scampered home, their hands sticky with fruit or sweetbread. Women gathered their baskets. Guards closed the town gates. And in the silence that followed, only the smell of trampled herbs and rotting food lingered in the air. The medieval market was not a sanitized or genteel institution. It was boisterous, dirty, and brimming with life. A theater of commerce and character, it bore witness to the full spectrum of human behavior, from noble enterprise to petty crime. And for all its flaws, it was the glue that held medieval communities together, one clamor-filled, muddy step at a time. Why medieval women had the hardest lives of all. To be born a woman in the medieval world was to be consigned, often from the very beginning, to a life of limitation, labor, and layered expectations. The social structures of the time were not kind to women. Indeed, they were crafted in such a way that nearly every avenue of life served as a barricade to female autonomy. Whether you were a peasant working the land, a merchant's wife in the city, or even a noblewoman cloistered behind castle walls, Your life was shaped by patriarchal laws, religious doctrine, and the whims of the men around you. From the moment a girl was born, her value was judged differently than that of a boy. Sons were seen as heirs, inheritors of land, carriers of legacy. Daughters, by contrast, were seen as future wives, whose primary duties would involve marrying well and producing offspring. In noble households, this might mean being married off as a political pawn as early as age 12. Dowries, payments made by the bride's family, were expected, and they often strained poor families who had several daughters to marry off. In peasant homes, girls began working alongside their mothers almost as soon as they could walk, gathering kindling, watching younger siblings, or helping in the fields. Education for girls was limited and highly dependent on social class. Noble girls might be taught reading, embroidery, and manners suitable for court life, while boys learned Latin, rhetoric, and history. Among the lower classes, literacy was rare for both sexes, but especially for women. The ability to read was seen as unnecessary for a woman whose future lay in domestic toil. Religious instruction was occasionally provided by nuns or monks, but it focused on morality, obedience, and the virtues of silence and submission. Work was unavoidable. For peasant women, daily life involved back-breaking labor, hauling water from distant wells, tending animals, preparing food from scratch, washing clothes by hand, maintaining fires, spinning wool, and tending gardens. The physical burden was relentless, often done while pregnant or caring for children. Illness, childbirth, and poor nutrition took a heavy toll. Women often gave birth in unsanitary conditions, with little understanding of hygiene or obstetric care. Death during childbirth was tragically common, and even survival didn't guarantee respite. Infant mortality rates were high, and grieving mothers were expected to continue working immediately. Marriage, the institution that shaped most women's lives, was rarely about love. It was a contract, an arrangement for social, economic, or political gain. Husbands had near total authority over their wives. Legally, a woman's identity was often subsumed by her husband's upon marriage. She could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or appear in court without male representation. If a husband abused his wife, the law offered little recourse. The church preached the sanctity of marriage, but it also urged women to suffer in silence and obey their spouses, modeling themselves on the Virgin Mary in patience and purity. Religious life offered one of the few alternatives. Becoming a nun provided some women with education, autonomy, and a role in community service. However, this path was only open to women whose families could afford the dowry required to enter a convent. Even within convent walls, strict rules governed behavior, and the ultimate goal was spiritual humility, not personal liberation. In cities, some women worked as artisans, traders, or brewers, often alongside their husbands. Widows could sometimes inherit and manage their late husband's business, making them relatively independent. But even in these cases, their authority was often challenged, and guilds usually excluded women from full membership. Any woman perceived as too assertive risked social scorn or accusations of witchcraft, a label frequently attached to women who defied norms or possessed healing knowledge. Women's health was poorly understood and often neglected. The prevailing medical theories, grounded in humorism, viewed female bodies as inferior, colder, and more prone to imbalance. Treatments ranged from herbal concoctions to bloodletting, often administered by male physicians with little regard for the patient's comfort or consent. Midwives, though indispensable, were looked upon with suspicion and frequently accused of malpractice or sorcery, especially when outcomes were poor. Social expectations policed every aspect of a woman's life. Chastity before marriage and fidelity afterward were rigorously enforced, at least for women. Men's infidelities were more readily overlooked. A woman caught in adultery might face public shaming, exile, or worse. Even widows, once free from marital constraints, were expected to live modestly and avoid attracting scandal. Clothing regulations or sumptuary laws dictated what women could wear, further reinforcing class and gender boundaries. The myth of the passive medieval woman is complicated by reality. Many women, through necessity or cunning, found ways to assert influence. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of France played pivotal roles in political life. Peasant women, though overworked, were often the backbone of their households. Some women ran successful taverns, markets, or even managed large estates in their husband's absence. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen contributed to theology, medicine, and music. But these examples were exceptions, not the rule. For the majority, life was a constant negotiation between duty and survival. Few had leisure or choice. Girls became wives, mothers, and laborers in quick succession. They bore the emotional weight of childrearing, the physical toll of work, and the spiritual burden of being told their suffering was virtuous. The medieval worldview placed women near the bottom of a divinely ordered hierarchy, their lives measured by obedience, chastity, and silence. To modern eyes, the plight of medieval women is both sobering and infuriating, but it also underscores the remarkable resilience of those who endured, adapted, and in rare cases defied the strictures of their time. Their stories, often unrecorded or filtered through male chroniclers, deserve recognition, not as background to male exploits, but as central to the human story of the Middle Ages. The science of medieval medicine will ruin your sleep. Step into the smoky, herb-scented chambers of a medieval healer's hut, and you'll quickly understand why many ailments led directly to death. The science of medieval medicine was a chaotic blend of superstition, antiquated texts, and trial and error guesswork. Though some herbal remedies were indeed beneficial, many practices ranged from ineffective to outright dangerous. The mere thought of bloodletting, leeches, and mercury-based treatments is enough to unsettle the stomach and make one profoundly grateful for modern medicine. The dominant medical theory of the time was based on the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to depend on keeping these bodily fluids in balance. A fever? You had too much blood. A depressive mood? Too much black bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance, often through purging, vomiting, or bloodletting, none of which addressed the root causes of illness and frequently made the patient worse. Physicians were rare and typically educated in universities where they studied not through experimentation, but by reading ancient texts from Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. Observation and dissection were discouraged, if not forbidden. The church played a significant role in maintaining the status quo. The body was considered sacred and inviolable, which meant actual anatomy was poorly understood. Ideas persisted for centuries, not because they worked, but because challenging them bordered on heresy. Most people never saw a physician. These learned men catered only to the wealthy elite and often traveled with a vast assortment of bizarre tools and powdered substances. For everyone else, healing fell to barber surgeons, local herbalists, midwives, or the wise old woman at the edge of town. Some remedies, particularly herbal ones, had some genuine efficacy: garlic for infections, willow bark for pain. But these successes were overshadowed by dangerous or mystical treatments. Cures for fevers included tying toads to your skin, reciting incantations, or applying powdered emeralds. Surgery was an option, though one best avoided. Without anesthetic, antiseptics, or knowledge of germ theory, even minor operations were excruciating and deadly. Arrow extractions and amputations were performed with little more than muscle, knives, and a tankard of ale for the patient. Post-operative infections were almost inevitable. The surgical instruments themselves, often reused without cleaning, were horror movie worthy: rusted saws, crude forceps, and scalpels that more closely resembled carpentry tools. Plagues and epidemics, such as the Black Death, highlighted the futility of medieval medical responses. People were advised to avoid bad smells, miasma theory, carry posies of herbs, or flagellate themselves to appease divine wrath. Quarantine efforts were rudimentary, and towns often burned down entire neighborhoods to prevent spread. The idea that diseases were caused by invisible microorganisms was centuries away. Astrology also played a large role in diagnoses and treatment. Physicians consulted star charts before prescribing remedies, believing the alignment of the planets could influence bodily health. Certain times of day or year were considered more auspicious for treatment. This belief added layers of delay and ritual to medical practice, often preventing timely interventions. One of the more disturbing aspects of medieval medicine was the willingness to incorporate animal products and excrement into treatments. Mouse paste for toothaches, goose grease for chapped skin, and even powdered mummy for vitality were not unusual. Urine was used for diagnostics, Color, clarity, and taste were all assessed with surprising seriousness. Physicians even maintained detailed urine charts. Childbirth, an incredibly dangerous time for women, was attended by midwives whose knowledge came from oral traditions. Though many were skilled, their practices could not counteract the poor hygiene and high risk of infection. Superstition played a heavy role. Charms, prayers, and talismans were part of the birthing process. Stillbirths, maternal mortality, and early infant death were tragically common. Mental illness was another field poorly understood and harshly treated. Melancholia, madness, and epilepsy were often attributed to demonic possession or moral failings. Treatments included chaining, beating, or exorcism. The concept of psychiatric care or humane treatment was utterly absent. Those suffering from mental conditions were frequently ostracized, imprisoned, or left to wander as outcasts. Hospitals existed, but were more spiritual than medical in function. Run by religious orders, they offered shelter, food, and prayer. Patients might receive basic care, but there was little focus on cure or recovery. Instead, illness was often seen as a divine test or punishment. Pilgrimages to holy sites were a common prescription, believed to bring healing through the intercession of saints. Despite the bleakness, not all was hopeless. The late medieval period began to see slow shifts. Arabic medical texts introduced new ideas. The use of distillation refined herbal remedies. Some surgeons, like Guy de Chauliac, advocated cleanliness and cauterization to prevent infection. Monasteries preserved ancient medical knowledge and served as centers for limited scientific inquiry. Yet overall, the medieval worldview conflated disease with sin, astrology, and imbalance of humors. Suffering was considered part of the divine plan. Curiosity was restrained by religious doctrine and reverence for classical texts. The result was a medical system that failed to prevent, diagnose, or treat most conditions with any reliability. If you had a simple cut that got infected, your odds of survival were grim. There were no antibiotics, no germ theory, and often no understanding that cleanliness mattered. You might be bled, bleached, or given a poultice of questionable ingredients. You might pray, consult an astrologer, or embark on a pilgrimage. More likely than not, your small wound would fester, turn septic, and quietly take your life while those around you chanted prayers and debated which humor had betrayed you. It is a terrifying thought that the smallest scratch could spell doom. Yet for the people of the Middle Ages, it was a daily reality, a reminder that their world, while rich in faith and resilience, was perilously devoid of the medical wisdom we now take for granted. How medieval people tried to predict the weather and failed. Step into the unpredictable world of medieval weather prediction, where science and superstition collided in a fog of ignorance and hopeful guesswork. Long before the development of meteorology, medieval people desperately sought ways to foresee the weather. Their livelihoods depended on it. Crops could fail, floods could destroy, and storms could kill. Unfortunately, their methods for predicting the elements were, for the most part, glorified folklore mixed with observational habits that often amounted to educated or not so educated guesses. Nature was the medieval man's barometer. The shapes and movements of clouds were scrutinized like omens. A red sky at morning, shepherd's warning. A red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Animal behavior was another go-to method. If swallows flew low, it was said to signal incoming rain. Frogs croaking more than usual, or cows lying down in a field, were likewise interpreted as signs of changing weather. These folk observations had a kernel of truth in them, yet lacked consistency, and without a broader understanding of atmospheric pressure or jet streams, they couldn't reliably predict what the sky would do next. Astrology played an outsized role in weather forecasting. Just as the positions of celestial bodies were believed to influence human health and fate, they were also thought to affect climate and weather. Almanacs were published with detailed predictions based on the stars, asserting when it would rain or snow according to the alignment of planets and zodiac signs. Farmers planted and harvested based on these charts, trusting the heavens to guide their timing. The trouble was, of course, that these predictions were based on astrology, not observable meteorological science. Sometimes they coincided with favorable weather, but just as often, they did not. Another medieval method of prediction was the observation of seasonal patterns, phenology as it is known today. People kept mental or written notes about when certain plants bloomed, when birds migrated, or when ice broke on rivers. They believed that nature followed a divine rhythm. While some of these observations had value, they didn't account for anomalies or extreme weather events. A mild spring one year could be followed by a bitterly cold one the next, throwing off the pattern entirely and leading to missed harvests or misjudged planting seasons. Perhaps most charming and tragically useless were the weather predicting saints. Religious belief saturated every aspect of medieval life, including weather forecasting. People believed that certain saints had the power to influence the skies. Prayers were offered to Saint Medard to stop rain, while Saint Swithin's Day was said to dictate 40 days of weather. If it rained on Saint Swithin's Day, legend held it would rain for 40 days straight. These beliefs were held with sincere devotion, and entire communities might adjust their seasonal expectations around such divine interpretations. The church also played a role in interpreting natural disasters as divine displeasure. Bad weather, especially storms, floods, or droughts, was often seen as a punishment for sin. This led to public acts of penance, processions, or even scapegoating. Jews, heretics, and accused witches were sometimes blamed for inciting divine wrath and bringing bad weather upon a village. In such a worldview, prediction mattered less than appeasement. Medieval chronicles are filled with dramatic accounts of freak weather events. Hailstones the size of apples, rivers turning to blood, snow in midsummer, all were documented with awe and terror, often accompanied by moral interpretations. Rather than asking why such things happened in a scientific sense, chroniclers asked what had we done to deserve this. Without the ability to understand or mitigate, people turned to storytelling, theology, and symbolic reasoning to explain the forces of nature. There were attempts, particularly later in the medieval period, to bring some order to the chaos. Monasteries recorded weather conditions in detailed chronicles, noting floods, droughts, and cold snaps year by year. These records, while not used for prediction at the time, became valuable for later historians and scientists. Some medieval thinkers began to toy with the idea of natural causes rather than purely divine ones, but these ideas remained on the fringes. The truth is, even the most learned medieval scholar had no real tools to predict the weather. There were no thermometers, barometers, or weather balloons, no models, satellites, or radar. The best forecasts came from short-term, highly local observations. If a storm was visible on the horizon, it might reach the village in an hour. If the wind shifted suddenly, rain might follow. Anything beyond that was guesswork, hope, or prayer. For farmers whose entire livelihoods were bound to the whims of the weather, this uncertainty was agonizing. A surprise frost could kill seedlings. A long drought could wipe out a harvest. A sudden flood could devastate a community. There was no crop insurance, no weather alerts, no contingency plans. You gambled with nature every season, and sometimes nature won. Even among the upper classes, weather prediction was more art than science. Nobles consulted astrologers before embarking on journeys. Kings might delay battles due to signs in the stars. Whole campaigns were derailed by rain, mud, or early snow, conditions no one could see coming. History itself was shaped by these meteorological unknowns. Looking back, it's easy to smile at the sheer optimism of trying to read the sky like a book or asking saints to delay a storm. But it also reflects a deep human need for control, for understanding, and for preparing against the unknown. Today, with all our satellites and sensors, we still get the weather wrong from time to time. For the people of the Middle Ages, wrong predictions were the norm, but they tried anyway, with the tools they had, the faith they held, and the sky overhead as their unreliable guide. The dark and boring world of medieval farming. Medieval farming was not only backbreaking and relentless, it was also astonishingly monotonous. Romantic visions of pastoral life with sunlit fields and cheerful plowmen do a grave disservice to the reality experienced by medieval peasants. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, farming was life, not an occupation among many, but the occupation. If you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly live and die within a few miles of your birthplace, spending the vast bulk of your days tilling the same soil, season after season, generation after generation. The day began at first light. There was no luxury of sleeping in when your survival hinged on daylight hours. Medieval farmers would rise before dawn to take advantage of every usable moment. A quick breakfast of coarse bread, perhaps with a little ale or watery porridge, sustained them as they trudged out into the fields with rudimentary tools. Forget gleaming steel plows or well-oiled machinery. The tools were simple: wooden plows tipped with iron, hoes, sickles, and scythes sharpened by hand. Oxen, not horses, were the primary beasts of burden for plowing, as they were cheaper and sturdier, though far slower. Crop rotation was the one shred of agricultural science medieval farmers had. The typical rotation involved a three-field system: one-third for winter crops like wheat or rye, one-third for spring crops like oats or barley, and one-third left fallow. This system helped reduce soil exhaustion, but also meant that only two-thirds of the land was productive at any given time. The fallow field would be grazed by animals whose manure helped fertilize the land. There were no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticides, no weather forecasts, just tradition, intuition, and luck. Weather was the farmer's greatest adversary. A late frost, summer drought, or sudden flood could spell catastrophe. Too much rain or too little could destroy months of labor. There were no irrigation systems to fall back on, no modern drainage systems to whisk away excess water. If the crops failed, famine loomed. The fear of starvation was a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of every season's hope. Bad harvests could mean not only hunger, but also an inability to pay rents or tithes, plunging families into debt and despair. Labor was communal, but never leisurely. Men, women, and even children were expected to contribute. Children as young as 5 might help scare birds from the crops or carry water. Women managed vegetable plots, tended livestock, cooked meals, made clothing, and participated in harvests. Work was so integrated into daily life that the concept of time off barely existed. Sundays were reserved for church, but even then, many snuck in chores before and after the Mass. Holidays tied to religious festivals were the only brief respites from the grind. The physical toll of farming was immense. Constant exposure to the elements left skin weather-beaten and joints inflamed. Injuries were common: cuts from sickles, crushed fingers, strained backs, and medical care was nearly non-existent. A minor wound could fester into a fatal infection. Tools were shared, rarely cleaned, and often dull, making labor not only inefficient but dangerous. Dental decay, malnutrition, and chronic exhaustion added to the physical burden. Life in the fields was also dull. There was no intellectual stimulation, no entertainment save for seasonal festivals or occasional traveling performers. The rhythm of life was dictated by the agricultural calendar, and that rhythm was repetitious in the extreme. Plow, sow, weed, harvest, repeat. Singing was one small joy. Peasants often sang while working, but even music could not erase the crushing sameness of daily toil. Housing for farmers was equally bleak. Most peasants lived in thatched huts with wattle and daub walls and dirt floors. A central hearth provided warmth and a place to cook, but smoke often lingered inside, stinging eyes and coating everything in soot. Furniture was sparse, often handmade and shared among many. Livestock might live inside with the family, particularly in winter, adding to the stench and noise. Privacy was unheard of. Generations cohabited in tight quarters with little separation. And then there was the lord. The land was not owned by the peasants, but held from a lord under the feudal system. In return for the privilege of working the land, peasants paid rent, often in grain or labor rather than money, and owed taxes to both the lord and the church. Labor services, known as corvée, required peasants to spend several days each week working the lord's lands instead of their own. These obligations didn't pause for bad weather or personal misfortune. If you failed to fulfill them, you risked fines or worse. It was bondage without chains, a form of servitude that defined your life. What about technological progress? Very little occurred during the early medieval period. The heavy plow and water mill were innovations, but they took centuries to spread and were often reserved for the better off or monastic lands. For the average peasant, the tools and methods used were little different from those of Roman times. Innovation was stifled by poverty, superstition, and a rigid social hierarchy that offered no incentive to improve productivity for those who didn't own the results. Seasons marked the only significant changes in a farmer's year. Spring brought planting, summer meant weeding and haying, autumn was for harvest, and winter was a time of relative rest, but also of cold, darkness, and fear. Winter was especially bleak. Food stores ran low, illnesses spread, and the days dragged. The poor insulation of peasant homes meant that families huddled together for warmth. Farming didn't stop entirely. Livestock still needed care, but most outdoor labor paused until the thaw. Despite all this, medieval peasants were not entirely joyless. Community ties were strong, and religious festivals offered moments of levity. Weddings, harvest feasts, and saints' days allowed for music, dancing, and rare indulgences. Even so, these were brief glimmers in a long stretch of tedium and toil. In retrospect, the life of a medieval farmer was defined by its grueling consistency. You worked because you had to. You endured because you must. There was no grand reward, no upward mobility, no retirement. There was the land, the sky, the seasons, and your hope that next year might be just a little better. For most, it never was. How medieval people survived without clocks or calendars. In the modern world, our days are structured by precise ticks of the clock and neat boxes on the calendar. We know when to wake, when to eat, when to meet, and when to rest, all carefully dictated by timekeeping devices. In medieval Europe, none of this existed for the average person. There were no digital clocks, no wall calendars, and not even widespread use of accurate mechanical clocks until much later in the Middle Ages. Yet somehow, life moved forward. People rose, worked, worshipped, and harvested their crops. But how did they manage time? The answer begins with the sun. The sun was the most consistent and visible timekeeper for medieval people. Dawn signaled the beginning of the workday, dusk marked its end. People spoke of time in relation to the position of the sun in the sky: sunrise, midday, vespers, and nightfall. The idea of hours as we understand them was abstract and often irrelevant to daily life. Instead, people experienced time in a fluid, intuitive way. They didn't need to know it was 7:45 a.m. They just knew it was light enough to start working. Church bells were another key marker of time. In monasteries, the day was rigidly divided according to divine office, a series of prayers recited at specific times. These included matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Monasteries kept some of the earliest mechanical clocks to signal these times. In towns and villages, church bells rang out to announce prayer times, call people to mass, or mark significant events like funerals and festivals. To an ordinary villager, the bell became the heartbeat of communal life. Calendars, in the modern sense of neatly printed pages with numbered days, didn't exist in medieval homes. Instead, the year was experienced through a cycle of seasons and religious festivals. The church calendar was the dominant framework, structuring the year with holy days, saints' feast days, and periods of fasting like Lent or Advent. People didn't think in terms of March 15th or October 3rd, they thought in terms of Michaelmas, Eastertide, or the Feast of St. John. Agricultural life also shaped how time was understood. Farmers knew when to sow and reap based not on the calendar, but on the signs of nature: the blossoming of trees, the length of days, the migration of birds, and the behavior of livestock. These natural indicators, combined with folk wisdom passed down through generations, provided a reliable guide. The arrival of spring wasn't marked by a date, but by the softening of the ground and the return of green shoots. Weather also played a critical role. Without weather forecasts or barometers, medieval people relied on keen observation and accumulated experience. A red sky at night, the behavior of animals, or the shape of clouds might all serve as omens. These interpretations were passed along in proverbs and lore, forming an informal but deeply rooted understanding of time and change. For merchants and travelers, the lack of precise timekeeping posed challenges. Traveling meant estimating the number of days to the next village or market, often relying on sunrise and sunset to measure the day's progress. For longer journeys, travelers marked time in weeks or holy days. We left after Easter, or we'll return by All Saints' Day. Delays were common, and punctuality, at least as we define it, was an alien concept. This fluid relationship with time extended into labor and contracts. Agreements might specify that a task be completed by mid-harvest or before Michaelmas, leaving considerable room for interpretation. Seasonal labor was common, and wages were often paid not by the hour but by the day, week, or task. The ambiguity of timekeeping sometimes led to disputes, but it was generally accepted as part of life. In larger cities, especially as the Middle Ages progressed, mechanical clocks began to appear in church towers and public buildings. These early clocks were marvels of engineering, driven by weights and gears, and often marked the hour with a bell chime. But even these clocks were far from precise. They might gain or lose time significantly, and they lacked minute hands. Still, their presence began to alter people's sense of time, especially in commercial and religious life. Monasteries were often the centers of early timekeeping innovation. Monks had a need for precision in order to maintain their schedule of prayers. Water clocks, sundials, and eventually mechanical clocks helped regulate these rhythms. Some monastic clocks were so advanced for their time that they included moving figurines or astronomical features. Even in cities, personal timepieces were rare and expensive. Portable sundials and hourglasses might be found among the wealthy or in guild halls, but the average person relied on communal signals and natural rhythms. Time remained a shared, public experience rather than a private, individual one. The medieval concept of time was also spiritual. Eternity loomed large in the medieval mind. Life on earth was temporary, a passage toward judgment and salvation. This worldview shaped how people perceived time, not as something to be optimized, but something to be endured and sanctified. Prayer, penance, and good works were investments in eternal life, making earthly minutes and hours feel trivial by comparison. Despite the absence of clocks and calendars, medieval people were not disorganized. Their world functioned with its own logic and order. Time was felt rather than measured, observed in shadows and sounds rather than counted in digits. Their systems of tracking time may seem alien or primitive to us, but they were deeply embedded in the rhythms of nature and faith. In many ways, this looser relationship with time may have reduced stress. There were no alarms, no hourly deadlines, no constant checking of watches. Life flowed in accordance with sunrise and sunset, with bells and birdsong, with the shifting colors of the sky. Time wasn't a tyrant, it was a companion, moving slowly and predictably. In conclusion, surviving without clocks or calendars required a deep intimacy with the natural and spiritual worlds. Medieval people listened to the land, to the church, and to each other. Their timekeeping was imprecise but profoundly human. And perhaps, in a world lit only by fire and ruled by seasons, that was all they truly needed. Why being a medieval blacksmith was an endless, sooty nightmare. In the sprawling, bustling villages and towns of medieval Europe, the blacksmith's forge was a crucial hub of activity. From horseshoes to swords, plows to nails, the blacksmith's handiwork shaped daily life and the very infrastructure of medieval society. Yet behind the indispensable role lay a brutal, grueling existence steeped in soot, smoke, and back-breaking labor. Being a medieval blacksmith was far from a glamorous craft. It was an endless, sooty nightmare, demanding relentless physical endurance and risking constant injury. The forge, a hellish workplace. Step into a medieval smithy, and you'd find yourself engulfed in intense heat, choking smoke, and the acrid smell of burning coal and metal. The forge was powered by a bellows, a large leather apparatus pumped manually to blow air into the fire, raising temperatures to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was essential for melting and shaping iron and steel, but also made the smithy unbearably hot, even on the coldest days. The fire wasn't just hot, it was unpredictable. Sparks flew constantly, black smoke filled the air, and the glowing embers threatened to burn everything nearby. Blacksmiths had to wear heavy leather aprons and thick gloves, but these provided only partial protection. Scorching burns, singed hair, and blackened skin were everyday hazards. The intense heat could cause exhaustion and dehydration, yet work could not simply stop. The village depended on the blacksmith to maintain tools, weaponry, and horseshoes. Endless physical labor. The life of a blacksmith was physically punishing. A typical day began before sunrise and stretched well into the evening. The smith spent hours at the anvil, swinging a heavy hammer to shape red-hot metal. This was grueling work. Repeatedly lifting and striking a tool weighing several pounds required immense strength and stamina. The smith's body bore the marks of this labor: thickened hands, scars, and worn joints. Besides hammering, blacksmiths also hauled heavy bags of charcoal or coal, stoked fires, and worked the bellows. They often bent over their workbenches for hours, risking back pain and exhaustion. The smoke and soot filled their lungs, leading to respiratory problems later in life. Unlike many other medieval workers, blacksmiths faced an especially high risk of occupational injury, from smashed fingers to eye damage from flying sparks. The constant danger of injury. Working with molten metal and blazing fires was inherently dangerous. One wrong move could mean a severe burn or permanent disability. Blacksmiths often worked with open flames and hot slag, which could stick to skin and cause deep wounds. Eye injuries from flying sparks or metal shards were common and often led to blindness, as medieval medicine offered little effective treatment. Accidents with heavy tools were frequent too. Dropping a hammer or getting fingers caught between the hammer and anvil could cause crushing injuries. The repetitive nature of the work also led to chronic conditions like arthritis. Despite these dangers, there was little in the way of safety regulation or medical aid, and blacksmiths had to simply endure and continue working. Soot and dirt, a never-ending battle. No matter how much care blacksmiths took, they were perpetually covered in soot, dirt, and grime. Their faces, hands, and clothing became permanently blackened, giving rise to the nickname the blacksmith's face. The soot was stubborn, often requiring harsh scrubbing and sometimes even abrasive materials like sand to remove. Yet in a time without modern soap or clean water readily available, true cleanliness was nearly impossible. This constant grime wasn't just an aesthetic problem, it posed health risks. Soot inhalation could cause chronic bronchitis or other lung diseases. The blacksmith's skin, covered with grime, was prone to infections and rashes. Clothes worn in the smithy quickly became threadbare and smelled perpetually of smoke and burnt coal, making social life difficult and reinforcing the smith's low social standing despite their vital role. Social status, respected yet marginalized. Despite the essential nature of their work, medieval blacksmiths occupied a curious place in the social hierarchy. They were respected for their skill and necessity. A village without a smith was doomed to collapse in many ways. However, their close relationship with fire and metal, elements associated with danger and mystery, sometimes placed them under suspicion or fear. In some areas, blacksmiths were thought to possess magical powers, due in part to their ability to transform raw ore into useful tools and weapons. This association with alchemy or sorcery could lead to mistrust. Their blackened appearance and the noisy, grimy work environment further alienated them socially, limiting their integration into higher social circles. Guilds began to form later in the medieval period, providing blacksmiths with some protection, training, and status. Yet, this came with obligations, high fees, strict rules, and pressure to maintain the guild's monopoly on certain types of metalwork. The physical toll on blacksmith families. Often, the blacksmith's home was near the forge, exposing family members to constant noise, smoke, and pollution. Children frequently helped with simpler tasks, but were also at risk of accidents. Wives managed the household while dealing with the harsh environment created by the forge's proximity. The life expectancy of a blacksmith was generally lower than other villagers due to the cumulative effects of soot inhalation, burns, injuries, and infections. Arthritis and chronic pain were common in old age, and many blacksmiths carried lifelong scars as a testament to their harsh trade. The never-ending demand and long hours. The medieval economy and warfare created endless demand for the blacksmith's services. Horseshoes wore out quickly, farm tools broke or bent, and weapons needed constant maintenance. The blacksmith's workload was relentless, and seasonal pressures like harvest or military campaigns could mean working round the clock. Unlike some craftsmen who might enjoy relative downtime, blacksmiths were always on call. A broken plow during planting season could mean lost crops. A damaged sword in battle could mean death. This perpetual urgency meant few breaks and little rest. Conclusion: the hidden cost behind the metal. In sum, being a medieval blacksmith was an existence defined by unyielding labor, constant danger, and relentless grind. Though their work was fundamental to medieval life, the price they paid was steep. Endless hours in a hellish environment, the threat of injury, lifelong exposure to harmful soot and smoke, and social marginalization made this craft a brutal daily struggle. How medieval people dealt with lice, fleas, and other horrors. In the dim, candlelit corners of medieval life, the constant presence of lice, fleas, and other vermin was an inescapable part of existence. These tiny tormentors weren't just occasional nuisances, they were permanent residents on the bodies and in the beds of the rich and poor alike. Unlike today's sanitizing sprays and medicated shampoos, medieval people faced these pests with a combination of resignation, folk remedies, and often futile rituals. Lice were perhaps the most common affliction. They made themselves at home in the hair, clothing, and bedding of nearly everyone, regardless of social class. Since bathing was infrequent, sometimes monthly, sometimes seasonally, lice thrived in the seams of garments and in unwashed hair. Linen undergarments helped somewhat. Wealthier individuals changed their linens more frequently, which could reduce infestations, but for the common peasant, a single shift might serve for weeks. One strategy against lice was shaving the head entirely. Monks and nuns, who already followed strict grooming codes, often had shaved tonsures that incidentally made it harder for lice to gain a foothold. Among lay people, especially children, lice combs, fine-toothed tools made of bone or wood, were used to remove both lice and nits. These combs were passed through the hair methodically, though results were never perfect. Fleas posed a similar challenge. They infested straw mattresses, wooden floors, and even cloaks and boots. Households might scatter herbs such as pennyroyal, lavender, or rue across floors and bedding in an effort to repel them. Some slept with bunches of mint under their pillows, not for sweet dreams, but to discourage pests. Flea traps were rudimentary but inventive. Shallow dishes of water with candles placed inside were set near beds. Attracted to the warmth, fleas would leap toward the flame and fall into the water. It was not uncommon for people to pick fleas and lice from one another as a social or even affectionate activity. Historical accounts describe nobles sitting together and removing fleas from each other's clothes, often while engaged in conversation. This mutual grooming was part practical, part intimate, and occasionally even romanticized in poetry and songs. Bedbugs, though less often mentioned, also plagued sleepers. With beds made of straw or rushes, hiding places were abundant. Regular changing and airing of bedding, more feasible in noble homes than among peasants, could limit their numbers, but few ever lived without them entirely. Burning old straw and replacing it periodically was one of the few effective methods known. Then there were the horrors that defied visibility: mites, worms, and intestinal parasites that thrived in unhygienic conditions. Medieval medicine attributed many of these afflictions to imbalanced humors or divine punishment, and so treatments ranged from bloodletting to prayer to herbal purges. Wormwood, tansy, and garlic were common remedies, though dosages were approximate and side effects not well understood. For many, cleanliness was not about germ prevention. It was about appearance, odor, and religious purity. Public bathhouses existed and were popular, especially in urban areas, but they fell out of favor during waves of plague and religious reform. When they were used, bathhouses might have helped reduce lice and flea populations temporarily, though shared towels and close quarters could also spread them. Ultimately, medieval people lived in constant cohabitation with these pests. Clothing, hair, and homes were rarely entirely free of them. But rather than obsess over eradication, they adapted. They scratched, they combed, they dusted herbs, and they carried on. Vermin were a shared misery, woven into the very fabric of daily life. And while their methods may seem unsanitary or quaint, their resilience in facing these creeping terrors without modern aid was nothing short of remarkable. The life of a medieval herald, yelling news and being ignored. If you found yourself living in medieval Europe and wanted to know what was happening in your town, your options were severely limited. There was no printing press until the 15th century, and literacy was mostly reserved for clergy and nobility. That meant the vast majority of people were functionally dependent on oral communication for any news, announcements, or proclamations. Enter the medieval herald, a profession equal parts town crier, civil servant, and glorified noisemaker. The role of a herald was as curious as was important. Heralds were employed by royalty, nobility, or municipalities to spread official messages to the public. Wearing a distinctive tabard adorned with their master's coat of arms, the herald was immediately recognizable, whether welcomed or not. Their job was to walk through villages, market squares, and fairs, often accompanied by drummers or trumpeters, and deliver the news in a loud, authoritative voice. It was less a performance and more a ritualistic duty. News of a new tax, the call to arms, royal births, deaths, laws, and decrees all flowed from the herald's lips, whether or not anyone particularly cared to listen. The herald's voice had to be powerful enough to carry over the clamor of livestock, blacksmiths' anvils, shouting merchants, and the general din of medieval street life. They used rhythm, rhyme, and repetition to help their announcements stick in the minds of an often distracted and illiterate crowd. However, there was no guarantee anyone paid attention. It was not uncommon for heralds to be ignored outright, heckled, or drowned out by louder activities in the town square. To some, they were as unwelcome as the news they brought, especially when proclaiming new taxes or conscriptions. Heralds had more responsibilities than simply reading public notices. In times of war, they served as messengers and intermediaries between warring factions, negotiating truces or delivering declarations of battle. Because of their neutral status, they were traditionally afforded some degree of protection, though this was not always honored. Theirs was a dangerous role. Delivering a message to an enemy camp could be a fatal task if the mood turned ugly. Beyond their ceremonial and wartime roles, heralds were deeply involved in the world of heraldry, the system of coats of arms and noble lineage that governed medieval identity and status. They maintained detailed records of noble families, their symbols, and genealogies. In tournaments, heralds organized and announced events, keeping track of combatants and verifying their noble credentials. They served as the guardians of social order within the often chaotic realm of medieval aristocratic pageantry. Despite their association with power, most heralds led relatively modest lives. While some were respected court officials, others existed on the fringes of importance, living in humble conditions and constantly on the move. They endured the elements, from rain-soaked villages to dusty roads, performing the same declarations over and over across the kingdom. Some even traveled internationally for diplomatic missions, placing them in dangerous political environments far from home. The social perception of heralds varied widely. In some places, they were valued for their connection to noble authority and their role in maintaining order. In others, they were seen as loud, nosy, and unwelcome. Because they so often bore bad news, especially new taxes or forced levies, they could be targets of public frustration. They had no real power to change what they declared, yet they were often blamed for the message. There was also an element of theater to the job. A good herald had to be a performer, someone capable of projecting not just sound, but gravitas. Their tabards, horns, and voices were part of a ritualized delivery that lent weight to the announcements. And yet, for all their bluster, they could be utterly ignored by a crowd more concerned with buying onions or chasing chickens. By the late Middle Ages, the invention of the printing press began to encroach upon the herald's territory. Town criers still existed, but pamphlets and printed broadsheets gradually took over the role of mass communication. Literacy spread slowly but surely, and the written word began to replace the shouted one. Even so, heralds held onto a ceremonial function well into the modern period, appearing at coronations, state events, and military parades. The life of a medieval herald was a strange mix of visibility and insignificance. They stood at the center of public life, yet wielded no personal influence. They bore the authority of kings, but often lacked the respect of the common folk. They were the original messengers, often punished, sometimes honored, but always necessary in a world where information had no wires to ride and no paper to print on. So the next time you read a news article or scroll past a push notification, spare a thought for the poor medieval herald. He had to walk miles, brave jeering crowds, yell into the wind, and hope, just hope, that someone would actually listen. What it meant to be a medieval servant, endless, thankless work. In the tapestry of medieval society, with its bold knights and resplendent lords, one thread was ever present, ever toiling, and seldom celebrated: the servant. To be a servant in the Middle Ages was to lead a life of tireless labor and utter invisibility. This role, encompassing a range of positions from kitchen scullions to ladies' maids and stable boys, was marked by relentless work, rigid hierarchy, and little to no recognition. In essence, being a servant was a life of endless, thankless duty, where one's labor upheld the grandeur of their masters while their own dignity and well being were routinely neglected. Servants were everywhere in the medieval world. In a lord's manor, a castle, or even a bustling merchant household, it was the unseen army of workers who ensured that daily life moved smoothly. The majority were born into the lower classes and had few choices. For many, entering service was a step up from rural peasant life. It offered regular food, basic shelter, and the proximity of power, even if one was never meant to touch it. In a large noble household, roles were sharply divided. The household might be governed by a steward or seneschal, who managed other servants. Below him were butlers who kept the wine cellar, cooks who labored over hearths and stifling kitchens, and chambermaids who cleaned and dressed their masters. There were laundresses constantly boiling linens, stable hands shoveling dung and grooming horses, and pages scuttling to run errands with perfect obedience. The work never ended. A cook might begin before dawn to prepare bread or stew over open flames, while a maid would spend her entire morning scrubbing rush-covered floors. Servants dressed their lords and ladies, trimmed their hair, prepared their baths, and sometimes even wiped their backsides. Their own hygiene, by contrast, was often neglected due to time constraints and limited access to clean water. Most servants lived in cramped, shared quarters, if not directly on the floor of the rooms they tended, and went to bed after everyone else had retired. There was no concept of weekends or consistent time off. A feast, a hunt, or the arrival of guests could mean 12 or 14-hour days. If one were lucky, they might receive tips or leftover food, though much depended on the whims of the master. Gratitude was rare. Discipline, however, was not. Mistakes were met with beatings, verbal abuse, or dismissal. Worse, female servants faced the constant threat of exploitation or assault from those in power with little to no recourse. Still, service was not always static. A clever servant could sometimes rise through the ranks. A kitchen boy might become an undercook. A page could one day become a squire. Some household servants, particularly those who showed loyalty and skill, earned the trust of their employers and were elevated to more stable, better paying roles. In rare cases, a servant's child might be apprenticed into a trade, escaping the cycle entirely. But these stories were exceptions. In city households, merchant families often employed servants as well, typically fewer in number but equally overworked. These servants did double duty, often acting as shop assistants while also managing domestic chores. In smaller homes, one servant might serve every role: cleaner, cook, nanny, and guard. Their labor made it possible for families to operate businesses while maintaining the appearance of prosperity and decorum. Servants were often the first awake and the last to sleep. They ate what was left, scraps, porridge, or hard bread, and were expected to be invisible unless summoned. Their loyalty was presumed, and privacy was non-existent. Some bonded deeply with the children they raised, only to be dismissed once the children came of age. Others served their masters faithfully for decades, only to be turned away in old age with no pension, no thanks, and no place to go. One of the cruelest ironies was that the better a servant did their job, the less they were noticed. Their role was to fade into the background, to make the impossible look effortless, and to exist in the spaces between commands. Their names were seldom recorded in chronicles, their voices largely absent from letters or literature. They were ghosts in the machinery of medieval life, vital, unappreciated, and perpetually exhausted. Religion offered some consolation. Churches preached humility and obedience, and many servants were told their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife. Feast days provided rare respite, with communal celebrations where servants could momentarily join in the joy, albeit still serving. Pilgrimages or festivals occasionally gave servants a chance to see the world beyond the manor walls, though even these opportunities were limited. Servants occupied a strange social space. They were not slaves, yet their freedom was constrained. They could, in theory, leave their posts, but economic reality meant few had the means or prospects to do so. The position came with dependency: food, shelter, protection, but at the cost of autonomy. Marriage was often discouraged, especially for live-in servants, and many were separated from their families for years at a time. In death, servants were often buried in unmarked graves. their passing noted only in household accounts, if at all. Their contributions were immense, yet history remembers few names. And perhaps that is the ultimate tragedy of the medieval servant's life. Not just that it was hard and thankless, but that it was almost entirely forgotten. To live as a servant in medieval times was to carry the weight of a household on one's back, often from childhood into old age. It was a life of rising before the rooster, serving until bones ached, and vanishing into the shadows as nobility feasted or entertained. It was an existence marked by labor and submission, driven by necessity and constrained by class. If history is a grand play, then the medieval servant was the stagehand, setting the scene, lifting the props, ensuring the actors shone, only to disappear behind the curtain without applause.